In 1521, Juan Ponce de Leon returned to Florida with priests, horses, and 50 soldiers, and left with a single arrow wound in his thigh that would kill him within weeks. The men who fired it left no written word, no name for their king that survives in their own tongue, only a wound that festered until Cuba's doctors gave up. Beneath the trees of this 125-acre island are millions of oyster shells and fish bones, piled by human hands until they formed terraces nearly 30 feet high. Somewhere among these enormous structures stood the seat of Carlos, king of the Calusa, a civilization powerful enough to dominate southwest Florida and sustain thousands without planting fields of corn. Across this continent, civilizations left behind the same disturbing contradiction: monumental evidence that they existed, followed by almost nothing explaining why they disappeared. And we're going to reconstruct what we can from what history failed to preserve. The water around Mound Key is the color of tea, stained by tannins bleeding out of mangrove roots, and at low tide the mudflats exhale a smell of salt and rot that has probably not changed in 2,000 years. Estero Bay looks at first glance like an unremarkable stretch of the Florida coastline. One more sheltered lagoon among thousands, ringed by red mangroves patrolled by ospreys. But rise above it, or study the old survey maps, and the water reveals something the mangroves have spent centuries trying to hide. 2 artificial islands sit in the bay, connected by a canal that runs arrow straight for most of its length. One of the islands climbs to more than 30 feet above sea level. None of it is natural. All 90-plus acres of Mound Key were built by hand from millions upon millions of shells. This was the capital of the Calusa. By the time Spanish ships began appearing on the horizon in the early 1500s, the Calusa controlled the entire southwestern coast of Florida, a domain stretching roughly from Tampa Bay to the Florida Keys, and inland across Lake Okeechobee. Spanish accounts describe a paramount chief, a man the conquistadors called Carlos, who could summon warriors from dozens of subject towns and who received tribute paid in shell beads, hides, and captives. He held an audience, according to those same accounts, in a building atop the highest mound at his capital, a structure Spanish witnesses estimated could hold 2,000 people. From that vantage point, the chief could look out over his canal system, his fish ponds, his water courts, and beyond them, the bay that fed his entire civilization. And feed it, the bay did. This is where the Calusa story begins to diverge from almost every other complex society in the pre-Columbian Americas. Archaeologists have found no evidence, none, that the Calusa practiced agriculture in any serious way. No maize, no beans, no squash fields. In a hemisphere where the rise of chiefdoms and kingdoms is almost universally tied to the domestication of crops, the Calusa built a stratified society, a standing military, monumental architecture, and long-distance trade networks entirely on the wealth of the estuary. Fish, shellfish, sharks, sea turtles. Some archaeologists have called them one of the only known examples of a complex non-agricultural society to emerge in North America. How do you feed a capital city, with courtiers and craftsmen and warriors who produce no food themselves, using nothing but nets and traps? The Calusa seem to have answered that question with engineering, weirs and canals that function like fish corrals, harvesting the bay's surplus with an efficiency that still puzzles researchers reconstructing the system today. Excavations led by archaeologist William Marquardt and his colleagues at the University of Florida, working at Mound Key since the 1980s and continuing into recent years, have peeled back some of this world layer by layer. Wooden structures, preserved in the anaerobic muck of a filled-in pond, still bore the tool marks of the carpenters who built them 1,000 years ago. Carved wooden masks and plaques, pulled from wet sites elsewhere in Calusa territory, most famously at Chimariko in the 1890s, showed an artistic sophistication that startled the archaeologists who first uncovered them. Animal effigies so finely rendered that early excavators struggled to keep them from disintegrating the moment they touched open air. The Calusa, it turned out, were not a footnote. They were an empire built on water. Then there is the matter of what the Spanish wanted from them, and what that wanting cost. Ponce de Leon encountered the Calusa on his first voyage to Florida in 1513, and he returned in 1521 with a larger expedition: soldiers, priests, horses, cattle, seed for planting, intending to establish a colony on the Calusa's own coastline. The Calusa attacked. Ponce de Leon took an arrow to the thigh in the fighting, was evacuated to Cuba, and died there within weeks. It was, by most accounts, the first serious Spanish military defeat in what would become the continental United States, delivered by a nation Europeans hadn't yet bothered to name in their own histories. The Calusa would go on to resist Spanish missionization for generations in a region where other native nations were being absorbed into the mission system. They were not, by outsider accounts, an easy people to convert or conquer. Jesuit missionaries who tried to establish a presence at the Calusa capital in the 1560s were driven out. A Spanish soldier named Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, held captive among the Calusa for years after being shipwrecked as a boy, later wrote one of the only detailed European accounts of their language and customs, a document that remains, to this day, one of the primary windows historians have into a civilization that otherwise left no writing behind. And that is where the trouble starts. Because sometime after the early 1700s, the Calusa, a nation that had turned back Ponce de Leon, that had ruled the estuary for perhaps 2,000 years, that numbered in the tens of thousands at Spanish contact, simply stop appearing in the record. Disease brought by European contact certainly took a toll, as it did everywhere in the Americas. Raids by other native groups, armed by British colonists to the north, pushed south into Calusa territory during the early 1700s. Some accounts describe Calusa refugees fleeing by canoe to Cuba alongside departing Spanish colonists in the 1760s, when Florida changed hands to the British. But the documentation is thin, contradictory, and full of gaps, and no one has ever definitively traced what happened to the bulk of the Calusa population, or explained how a nation of that size and organization could disappear so completely from written history within the span of 2 centuries. Some historians argue the Calusa simply merged into the Seminole and other emerging groups, their identity absorbed rather than erased. Others point to the silence in the archaeological record after a certain point and wonder if the collapse was faster and more total than the gradual assimilation theory allows, a population crash driven by epidemic disease moving ahead of any European who could record it, striking a nation that had never been exposed to Old World pathogens before. A few more speculative voices have gone further still, pointing to gaps in the Spanish record and asking whether entire Calusa towns were wiped from the map by conflicts that went undocumented altogether, their fate never written down, because no one who witnessed it lived to tell a scribe. What's left is the shell, millions of tons of it, piled into mounds across the southwest Florida coast, watercourts and canals still visible from the air if you know where to look. A language that survives today in perhaps 50 recorded words. Mound Key itself sat forgotten under scrub brush for centuries before archaeologists began to recognize what they were looking at. Not a natural rise in the mangroves, but the bones of a capital. Stand on that mound today, at the height where a king once held court over 2,000 subjects, and look out at the quiet water. It fed an empire once. It swallowed one too. And no one has ever fully explained how or why so little of the Calusa was left behind to be found. Red ochre, ground fine and mixed with oil, coating skin, clothing, tools, canoes. A color so central to one people's identity that outsiders eventually named an entire racial category after it, mistaking a cultural practice for a biological trait. The wind here carries salt instead of spring water, cold Atlantic gusts sweeping across a rocky, fog-bound island far to the north of anywhere yet visited in this exploration. Newfoundland, homeland of the Beothuk, whose story ends not in dispersal or absorption, but in something far rarer and far more finally documented. Complete extinction, witnessed, recorded, and, even now, not entirely explained. The Beothuk lived on the island of Newfoundland for at least 2,000 years before European contact, likely longer, descended from earlier indigenous populations who had occupied the island across multiple cultural phases, stretching back thousands of years further still. By the time of sustained European arrival, the Beothuk had developed a distinctive seasonal way of life built around Newfoundland's coastal and interior resources, moving between coastal fishing and sealing grounds in warmer months and inland caribou hunting territory as winter approached, following the island's caribou herds along established migration routes with an intimate generations-deep knowledge of the terrain. Their practice of coating body, clothing, and possessions with red ochre, likely serving ceremonial, practical, and possibly spiritual purposes, became so visually striking to early European visitors that it directly shaped the term Red Indian, a phrase later generalized inaccurately and destructively across the entire indigenous population of North America. A linguistic error with a very specific, very traceable origin point right here on this one island. Newfoundland's position made it among the very first parts of North America to experience sustained European contact, with Basque, Portuguese, French, and English fishing fleets working its coastal waters from at least the early 16th century onward, decades before most of the peoples already examined in this series had encountered Europeans at all. That early prolonged contact did not bring the kind of formal colonization, mission systems, or land treaties seen elsewhere in this exploration. Instead, it brought something more diffuse and, in its own way, more relentless. A slow, sustained displacement of the Beothuk from their traditional coastal territories by European fishing operations that occupied the same prime coastal sites the Beothuk had always relied on, pushing Beothuk communities gradually inland, away from the rich marine resources their seasonal economy depended on, and into direct competition with each other for increasingly limited interior resources. Unlike so many of the massacres and epidemics chronicled elsewhere in this series, Beothuk decline unfolded across nearly 3 centuries of chronic, grinding pressure rather than a single documented catastrophe. European fishing crews and, later, permanent settlers periodically killing Beothuk individuals in isolated, sporadic violence rarely investigated or punished by any colonial authority. Disease introduced through generations of intermittent contact, and, perhaps most consequentially, the systematic loss of coastal access that undermined the Beothuk's entire seasonal subsistence strategy. Compounding this pressure, European settlement also brought Mi'kmaq groups from mainland Nova Scotia into increasing contact and, at times, conflict with the Beothuk over Newfoundland's shrinking resources, adding yet another source of strain to an already deteriorating position. By the early 19th century, colonial authorities in Newfoundland, increasingly aware that Beothuk numbers had fallen to a fraction of what earlier accounts described, made several documented attempts at peaceful contact, hoping to establish some form of relationship that might prevent the outright disappearance the population trajectory clearly suggested was coming. These efforts produced one of the most poignant and closely studied sequences in Canadian Indigenous history: the capture, in 1819, of a Beothuk woman named Demasduit, taken during a violent encounter that killed her husband, and held by colonial authorities who hoped, genuinely if naively, that establishing contact through her might open broader communication with remaining Beothuk communities. Demasduit died of tuberculosis before she could be returned to her people. A decade later, in 1829, a woman named Shanodithit, believed to be among the very last full-blooded Beothuk alive, came into contact with colonial society under similar circumstances and spent her final years working with a colonial official named William Cormack, providing what would become the single most substantial surviving body of information about Beothuk language, culture, and recent history. Drawings, vocabulary, and oral accounts recorded in the last months before her death from tuberculosis in June 1829, an event colonial records treated with striking finality as marking the effective extinction of the Beothuk as a people. That declaration of extinction has never been entirely uncontested. Some historians and indigenous researchers have argued that individual Beothuk survivors, or people of partial Beothuk descent, may have been absorbed into Mi'kmaq or European-descended Newfoundland communities in the years before and after Shanodithit's death, their specific ancestry unrecorded or deliberately obscured within later census categories that made no effort to track it. Genetic and genealogical research conducted in more recent decades has explored these possibilities with real seriousness, though establishing conclusive Beothuk descent through documented lineage remains difficult given how sparse and inconsistent surviving records from this period actually are. The question of whether Shawnauditheit's death in 1829 truly marked the final end of Beothuk lineage, or simply the end of documented, openly acknowledged Beothuk identity, remains genuinely unresolved. Archaeological work across Newfoundland continues to locate Beothuk habitation sites, seasonal camps, and burial locations, expanding what Shawnauditheit's own testimony and Cormac's records could describe. But the material record remains constrained by the same problem seen throughout this series. A culture documented largely through the eyes and interests of outsiders, arriving, as always, closer to the end than the beginning. Shawnauditheit's drawings survive, preserved in archives, offering a rare first-hand Beothuk visual record of caribou hunts, dwellings, and community life. A final testimony, deliberately created from someone who understood, by the time she made it, precisely what she was documenting the end of. Somewhere in Newfoundland's fog and rock, in inland caribou country, and along a coastline reshaped by 5 centuries of fishing fleets, does any trace remain of the people who colored themselves in ochre red enough to rename a continent's entire indigenous population by mistake? And did their story, despite the certainty of that 1829 declaration, actually end there? Or does it simply grow quieter, the way so many others in this exploration have, past the point where anyone thought to keep writing it down? 3 centuries before Shawnauditheit sat with William Cormac sketching caribou hunts for a colonial record that would outlive her people, another indigenous testimony was already being carefully compiled 1,000 miles south, in the mission towns of Spanish Florida. Not drawings this time, but grammar. Full sentences. A printed catechism, produced in 1612, representing one of the earliest and most complete documentations of any North American indigenous language before its speakers, too, would eventually disappear entirely. This was the language of the Timucua, and their story, spanning nearly the whole of Spanish Florida's northern reach, connects and complicates nearly every other Florida chapter already explored in this series. The Timucua were never a single unified nation in the way that phrase might suggest. Rather, Timucua describes a broad linguistic family, shared across as many as 35 distinct chiefdoms scattered throughout northern and central Florida and into southeastern Georgia, related by language but politically independent, sometimes allied, sometimes actively hostile to one another. A linguistic and cultural landscape considerably more complex than the single chiefdom stories examined elsewhere in this exploration. The Acuera, discussed in the previous chapter, were themselves one Timucua-speaking chiefdom among many, their story simply one thread within this much larger fabric, which is precisely why their individual fate proved so difficult to trace separately from the broader Timucuan collapse. At the moment of earliest sustained European contact in the 16th century, the collective Timucuan population across this territory likely numbered somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people by most modern scholarly estimates, organized into substantial agricultural towns supporting corn, beans, and squash cultivation across a landscape of pine flatwoods, oak hammocks, and river systems draining toward both Florida coasts. French colonists at Fort Caroline in the 1560s, and more extensively Spanish missionaries beginning in earnest during the 1580s and 1590s, left behind an unusually rich documentary record of Timucuan life, culture, and language, richer in many respects than what survives for almost any other people examined in this series, precisely because the sustained Spanish mission presence in Timucuan territory lasted longer and reached deeper than the comparatively brief or inconsistent contact experienced by coastal peoples like the Ice or interior chiefdoms like the Acuera. That documentation reached its peak through the work of Francisco Pareja, a Franciscan friar who spent decades among the Timucua and who produced, beginning in 1612, a series of published works including grammars, catechisms, and confessional manuals written in the Timucua language using Latin script. the earliest published grammar of any indigenous language north of Mexico, an achievement of genuine linguistic significance that preserved vocabulary, grammatical structure, and religious vocabulary in far greater depth than the fragmentary word lists that represent all that survives for peoples like the Moneton or the Mayaimi. And yet even this comparatively rich documentation could not prevent the same devastating trajectory that struck nearly every other Florida people in this exploration. Epidemic disease moved through Timucuan mission populations repeatedly across the 17th century, with documented outbreaks in the 1610s, 1650s, and 1670s, each cutting deeply into a population already strained by the demands of Spanish mission labor obligations. By the century's end, the same wave of English-allied Creek and Yamasee raiding that devastated Apalachee province in 1704 tore through Timucuan mission towns as well, in campaigns that Spanish records describe with comparable devastation. Mission towns burned, populations killed or captured, survivors driven south toward St. Augustine seeking whatever protection Spanish colonial authority could still offer, which by this point was not very much at all. By the time Spain ceded Florida to Britain in 1763, the documented Timucuan population, once numbering well over 100,000, had collapsed to a figure some colonial records place in the low hundreds. Among the most severe proportional population losses recorded for any indigenous nation in North America, achieved across roughly 2 centuries of sustained contact, epidemic, warfare, and mission-driven social disruption. The final documented Timucuan speakers, along with remnant populations of several other South Florida peoples already discussed in this series, evacuated to Cuba during that 1763 transfer, and Timucua as a spoken language appears to have died out entirely within a generation or two afterward, its last fluent speakers passing away somewhere in Spanish colonial Cuba, undocumented by name, unrecorded by any linguist comparable to Cormac, or later, Kreber. This absence sits uneasily alongside Pareja's remarkably thorough 17th century documentation and raises a genuine question worth sitting with. How does a language this well recorded on paper still manage to die completely, its last living speakers passing in obscurity a world away from the mission presses that once printed their grammar? Modern linguists working to reconstruct Timucua rely almost entirely on Pareja's centuries-old texts, since no recordings, no direct 20th century fieldwork, and no confirmed living heritage speakers exist to check that reconstruction against. Meaning, Timucua exists today as one of the very few indigenous North American languages known primarily through documents rather than through any living or even recently living connection to its speakers. Archaeological work across the former Timucuan territory continues to identify mission sites, town locations, and earlier pre-contact settlements, many still incompletely excavated across the sprawling geography 35 different chiefdoms once occupied. Somewhere within that vast, scattered record, mission foundations beneath Florida pine forest, unexcavated town sites along Georgia's coastal plain, Cuban parish records that might yet reveal a name or two of those final exiled speakers. Does any further trace remain of the 100,000 voices Pareja's grammar once tried to capture on paper? And what does it mean that a people this thoroughly documented on the page could still slip so completely from the world, leaving behind more written words than almost any other lost nation in this exploration? And yet no one left who could still speak them. Paper and print, in the end, could preserve Pareja's grammar far better than they could preserve the people who once spoke it. Stone endures differently. And at the mouth of the Miami River, where that river empties into Biscayne Bay, a different kind of record waits in the bedrock itself. A series of post holes cut directly into ancient limestone, arranged in a near-perfect circle roughly 38 feet across, discovered by archaeologists only in 1998, during construction work that very nearly destroyed it before anyone realized what lay beneath the site. This is the Miami Circle, and the people most archaeologists believe carved it were the Tequesta, South Florida's coastal chiefdom, whose story closes out this exploration of Florida's most persistently mysterious lost nations. The Tequesta occupied the southeastern tip of the Florida peninsula, territory centered around Biscayne Bay and extending along the coastline that would, centuries later, become Miami and its surrounding communities. Like the Calusa to their west and the Eyes further north along the Atlantic coast, the Tequesta built their society around the exceptional marine resources of South Florida's coastal waters, rather than intensive agriculture, fishing, gathering shellfish, and hunting across a landscape of mangrove, hardwood hammock, and coastal prairie that offered relatively poor soil for farming, but extraordinarily rich access to fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. Spanish accounts from the 16th century, including references connected to the same Fontaneda, whose captivity narrative has already illuminated so much of this South Florida story, describe the Tequesta as a distinct chiefdom maintaining complex relationships, sometimes cooperative and sometimes contentious, with the more powerful Calusa Confederacy that dominated much of southwest Florida during the same period. The Miami Circle itself remains, even now, a site more argued over than fully explained. Radiocarbon dating and associated artifacts suggest the site saw use across a long span of time, with some evidence pointing to construction and habitation stretching back roughly 2,000 years, well before the historic Tequesta chiefdom Spanish chroniclers eventually documented. The post holes themselves, carved with evident precision directly into solid limestone bedrock using tools without benefit of metal, have been interpreted by different archaeologists as the foundation of a substantial ceremonial or council structure, a residence for a person of significant status, or possibly an astronomically aligned structure whose orientation may have marked solstices or other significant calendrical points. Interpretations that remain genuinely debated within professional archaeology, none conclusively proven over the others. The site's true purpose still argued in academic literature more than 2 decades after its discovery. What makes the Miami Circle's story particularly striking, beyond the archaeological puzzle itself, is the sheer improbability of its survival at all. Discovered during demolition and construction work intended to clear the site for luxury high-rise development in one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in South Florida, the circle was preserved only after a sustained public preservation campaign and, ultimately, government acquisition of the property in 1999. A rare instance in this entire exploration where a significant indigenous site was actively saved from destruction rather than lost to it, standing in stark contrast to the countless Tocobaga, Ice, and Mayaimi mounds bulldozed for development with no comparable public reckoning. How many other sites just like it, elsewhere along Florida's densely developed coastline, were not so fortunate, cleared before anyone thought to look closely at what lay beneath the ground? The Tequesta's own historic era fate follows a familiar arc by this point in the exploration, though compressed into a notably short span. Sustained Spanish missionary contact arrived relatively late and briefly, with a short-lived Jesuit mission attempt in the 1560s collapsing quickly, not unlike the failed early effort among the Tocobaga to the north. Epidemic disease, introduced through generations of intermittent Spanish contact even without a lasting mission presence, steadily reduced Tequesta numbers across the following 2 centuries. By the time Spain transferred Florida to Britain in 1763, surviving Tequesta, like the Ayais, Mayaimi, Acuera, and Timucua remnants already documented in this series, evacuated largely to Cuba, a mass departure that effectively closed the historic chapter on South Florida's indigenous coastal peoples within the span of a single generation. And yet the physical record beneath South Florida's soil continues to complicate any tidy narrative of that ending. Beyond the Miami Circle itself, archaeologists working throughout the Miami area and Biscayne Bay region have identified additional shell-midden sites, burial locations, and habitation evidence. Much of it discovered only incidentally during modern construction in one of the most rapidly developed urban areas in the entire southeastern United States, meaning that South Florida's archaeological record is, in a very real sense, still being written in real time, one construction project at a time, decades or centuries after the people who left that evidence behind had already disappeared from any documented account. What was actually built atop that limestone circle 2,000 years ago, and by whom, precisely, remains unresolved even after careful modern excavation. A mystery preserved not through any deliberate indigenous or colonial record, but through sheer geological luck, cut into bedrock too solid for time or tide to erase, and saved from a bulldozer only by narrow margin. Somewhere beneath Miami's glass towers and waterfront developments, in ground that has already yielded one genuinely startling discovery, what else might still be waiting? Close enough to the surface that the next excavation permit, the next luxury foundation poured into that same ancient limestone, could bring it back into the light before anyone quite expects it. Fontaneda was not the only shipwrecked Spaniard to spend years living among the very people his countrymen would later record as vanished. Decades before Fontaneda drifted into South Florida captivity, another castaway, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, washed ashore on a barrier island along the Texas Gulf Coast in November 1528, the sole survivor of a disastrous expedition, and found himself entirely dependent on the mercy of a coastal people Spanish sources would eventually call the Karankawa, beginning one of the strangest and most extensively documented survival stories in early American history, and opening a window onto a people whose later reputation would grow far darker and far more contested than anything Cabeza de Vaca himself actually witnessed. The Karankawa occupied a long stretch of the Texas Gulf Coast, from roughly Galveston Bay southward toward Corpus Christi Bay, a landscape of barrier islands, coastal marsh, and brackish bays that shaped a distinctive seasonal economy built around fishing, oyster gathering, and hunting, supplemented by seasonal movement between coastal and slightly inland territory as resources and weather dictated. Physically, Spanish and later American observers consistently described the Karankawa as notably tall, and their material culture included practices that struck outsiders as visually striking even by the standards of an era already documenting many unfamiliar indigenous customs. Decorative body piercing, tattooing, and the use of alligator grease as protection against the coast's notoriously aggressive mosquito populations. Details recorded across multiple independent accounts spanning nearly 3 centuries of contact. Cabeza de Vaca's own account, eventually published as part of his broader narrative of survival and eventual return to Spanish territory, describes the Karankawa communities who sheltered him with genuine complexity. Periods of harsh treatment and forced labor alongside documented instances of care during illness and genuine hospitality. A portrait considerably more nuanced than the purely hostile or purely idealized depictions that often characterize early contact narratives elsewhere in this exploration. He lived among various Texas coastal and interior groups, including communities identified with the Karankawa, for roughly 6 years before eventually continuing his overland journey toward Spanish Mexico, making his account one of the earliest and most sustained first-hand European descriptions of any Texas indigenous people, comparable in some respects to Fontaneda's later South Florida captivity narrative, though produced under considerably more desperate initial circumstances. That early, relatively balanced 16th century portrait would not survive the centuries that followed intact. By the time of sustained Spanish, and later Mexican and American, settlement of the Texas coast in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Karankawa had acquired a reputation, propagated extensively through settler accounts and later popular history, as a uniquely violent and cannibalistic people, a characterization that, like the accusations already examined regarding the Atakapa and Tonkawa, rests on a documented but genuinely contested historical foundation. Some contemporary accounts do describe ritual practices connected to warfare that included consumption of enemy remains, a practice attested, as with those other peoples, in specific ceremonial rather than dietary contexts. But historians studying the Karankawa's documentary record have increasingly noted how thoroughly this reputation was amplified, and in some documented instances, apparently fabricated outright, by later Texas settlers and promoters with clear incentive to justify the aggressive displacement and, in several documented episodes, outright killing of Karankawa communities who stood between settlers and prime Gulf Coast land. The most consequential of these episodes unfolded across the 1820s and into the 1840s, as Stephen F. Austin's Texas colonization efforts and subsequent Anglo-American settlement expanded directly into core Karankawa territory. Documented conflicts, land seizures, and organized violence throughout this period, sometimes explicitly sanctioned by Texas colonial and later Republic authorities, steadily reduced Karankawa numbers and territory across barely 2 decades. By the 1840s and 1850s, following Texas statehood, surviving Karankawa communities had been reduced to small, scattered remnants, and mainstream historical accounts describe the Karankawa as functionally extinct as a distinct society by roughly the 1850s, their final remaining members reportedly absorbed into Mexican border communities or other regional indigenous groups, though the documentary trail here, as with so many peoples in this series, thins considerably at precisely the moment historians most need it to remain clear. This is where legitimate historical uncertainty gives way to more speculative territory, and it is worth naming that shift honestly. Persistent local traditions along the Texas Gulf Coast, along with some genealogical research conducted by individuals and communities claiming Karankawa descent, suggest that small numbers of Karankawa or partial Karankawa families may have survived considerably longer than the standard 1850s extinction narrative allows, quietly integrating into Mexican-American and other mixed communities along the border region without maintaining any publicly documented tribal identity, for reasons historians can reasonably speculate about, given the violent reputation and active persecution Karankawa identity carried throughout the 19th century. Establishing this continuity with the kind of documentary confidence available for, say, the Tonkawa's confirmed 20th century survival remains difficult, resting more on oral family tradition and circumstantial genealogical work than on the kind of unbroken institutional record other surviving tribes can point to. Archaeological evidence along the Texas coast, including shell-midden sites and burial locations near Galveston Bay and further south, continues to add detail to the pre-contact and early historic Karankawa story, even as the full record of their final decades remains genuinely incomplete. What actually happened to the Karankawa families who simply stopped appearing in any settler account after the 1850s? Did they die out entirely, as the standard narrative holds? Or did some quietly persist, their identity deliberately obscured by a reputation that made open Karankawa ancestry a liability for generations afterward? Along a coastline that once watched a shipwrecked Spaniard wash ashore and somehow survive 6 years among strangers, what other stories might still be waiting, half remembered in family tradition, for someone willing to ask the right questions of the right descendants before that thread, too, goes quiet for good? Far off the Texas coastline that sheltered Cabeza de Vaca, across the entire breadth of the continent and out into the Pacific itself, lies a small, wind-swept, and almost entirely uninhabited island some 61 miles off the coast of Southern California. A place so isolated that its final indigenous story would not conclude in any documented massacre, epidemic, or mission record. But in 18 years of complete solitude, one woman surviving entirely alone on an island the rest of the world had simply abandoned around her. This is San Nicolas Island, and the story belongs to Nicoleno. San Nicolas is the most remote of California's Channel Islands, a small, arid landmass roughly 9 miles long, offering limited fresh water and a challenging environment even by the standards of the Channel Islands generally, yet supporting indigenous habitation for a documented period stretching back at least several thousand years, based on extensive archaeological evidence of shell middens, tool workshops, and habitation sites scattered across the island. The people who lived there, known to history as the Nicoleno, developed a maritime culture built around fishing, sea mammal hunting, and shellfish gathering, connected culturally and likely linguistically to the broader Gabrielino Tongva and other Channel Islands indigenous groups of the Southern California mainland and nearby islands, though the Nicoleno's own specific language was never adequately documented before it disappeared, leaving their precise linguistic affiliation a matter of scholarly inference rather than direct record. By the early 19th century, the Nicoleno population had already been reduced dramatically, a decline driven substantially by violent conflict with Russian and Alaska native otter hunting expeditions operating along the California coast during this period, expeditions that, according to surviving accounts, killed a significant portion of the island's small population during disputes connected to the lucrative sea otter trade in the 1810s. This single documented episode of violence appears to have left the remaining Nicoleno population critically diminished, setting the stage for what followed roughly 2 decades later, when Franciscan missionaries at Mission Santa Barbara, aware of the island's small remaining population, arranged for the Nicolenos' removal to the mainland around 1835, seeking to resettle the last islanders within the mission system as San Nicolas's indigenous community approached its final, unsustainable numbers. According to the accounts that survive, the evacuation ship departed with the Nicoleno aboard, but one woman was left behind. Accounts differ on precisely why, with some versions describing her jumping from the ship to search for a missing child, others describing more confused or contested circumstances of separation amid a hurried departure, complicated by rough weather. What is not disputed is what followed. For the next 18 years, this woman lived entirely alone on San Nicolas Island, with no further contact from the mainland, no rescue attempt reaching her, and, as far as any surviving record indicates, no other Nicoleno remaining anywhere to share the island or confirm her fate. She was finally discovered in 1853 when a party led by George Nidever, a mainland trapper and sea captain who had heard persistent rumors of a solitary woman surviving on the island, located her living in a hut constructed partly from whalebone, dressed in a garment made of woven cormorant feathers, and apparently in remarkably good health despite nearly 2 decades of complete isolation. Brought to the mainland and housed at Mission Santa Barbara, she was baptized under the name Juana Maria, since no Nicoleno speaker remained anywhere to communicate with her in her own language and translate what she might have called herself, or to record any substantial account of the 18 years she had just survived entirely alone. She died just 7 weeks after her rescue from what mission records describe as dysentery, likely connected to the dramatic and sudden change in diet and environment following her removal from the island. This is, even set against the many uncertain endings already chronicled in this exploration, an unusually stark case of information lost at the precise moment it might have been recovered. 7 weeks represented by any measure, an almost impossibly brief window in which to document an entire language, an 18-year survival story, and whatever remained of Nicoleno cultural memory before its last speaker died. And by all surviving accounts, that documentation simply never happened in any systematic way, whether from the mission's limited resources, the language barrier itself, or simply the assumption, common to the era, that her story mattered less as a subject of careful ethnographic record than as a curiosity to be briefly noted and then set aside. What questions linger from those 18 solitary years are genuinely unanswerable now, though they have not stopped researchers from asking them. How did she survive alone on an island with limited fresh water for nearly 2 decades? And what does that survival suggest about the depth of ecological and practical knowledge a Nicoleno woman would have carried even after her community's population had already collapsed around her? Archaeological work on San Nicolas Island, including a cave discovered in 2012 that some researchers have proposed, with real caution, might correspond to her dwelling described in Nidever's account, continues to add physical detail to a story otherwise almost entirely without her own voice attached to it. Since no reliable transcription of her language or personal account survives in any form beyond secondhand, English language description filtered through observers who had no way to understand what she was actually telling them. The whalebone hut is gone. The cormorant feather garment survived only briefly before being lost by most accounts in a fire at the mission decades later. What remains is a name assigned by strangers, a burial site on the mainland whose exact location remains disputed among historians, and 18 years of documented solitude on a small Pacific island that, even now, keeps most of its silence intact. What did she see out there, alone, across nearly 2 decades no one else witnessed? And what did she try to say in those final 7 weeks that no one left alive could understand well enough to write down? Silence answered by strangers, Information lost in a 7-week window that closed before anyone thought to ask the right questions. That same problem of a story ending just past the point where documentation might have caught it closes this exploration by circling back to where it effectively began, the shores of Lake Erie and the people whose name the lake still carries, though almost nothing else about them survived their war with a far larger power. Lake Erie is the shallowest and warmest of the 5 Great Lakes, a body of water quick to turn violent when Great Lakes storms sweep across its open surface, bordered along its southern shore by the sandstone bluffs and hardwood forests of what is now Ohio, Pennsylvania, and western New York. Long before any European mapped its coastline, this territory belonged to a populous agricultural Iroquoian-speaking people the French would eventually record as the Erie, though the name most closely associated with them in the historical record, the Nation de Chat, or Cat Nation, actually comes from French missionaries and traders who noted, with evident curiosity, the presence of bobcats or mountain lions living in unusual abundance throughout Erie territory, animals significant enough to the Erie's own identity, or at least to outsiders' perception of it, to lend an entire nation its European name. What the documentary record actually preserves about the Erie themselves is remarkably thin, especially set against the extensive linguistic and ethnographic material Franciscan missionaries like Pereira compiled for the Timucua, or the detailed personal narratives Cabeza de Vaca and Fontaneda left behind after years living directly among the peoples they described. No Jesuit spent extended time within Erie territory recording their language or customs firsthand. What survives comes almost entirely secondhand, through the brief, scattered references of missionaries working among neighboring nations, describing the Erie as populous, organized into fortified towns, and formidable enough that other Iroquoian peoples treated them with genuine caution. A reputation built, apparently, without the benefit of European firearms, which the Erie, unlike the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to their east, had only limited access to through Dutch and French trade networks. That imbalance proved decisive. When the Huron Confederacy collapsed under sustained Haudenosaunee military pressure in 1649, refugees scattered across the eastern woodlands, and some found shelter among the Erie, an act of hospitality that, according to the conventional historical account, gave the Five Nations Confederacy justification for war. The Erie-Iroquois conflict that followed through the mid-1650s is documented only in outline. Jesuit sources describe Haudenosaunee war parties, armed with Dutch muskets, overwhelming Erie towns whose defenders fought largely without comparable firearms. One recorded siege alone involving several thousand Erie warriors and their families sheltering behind wooden palisades before being overrun. By 1656, Jesuit writers were already referring to the Erie in the past tense, their society effectively destroyed within roughly half a decade of concentrated warfare. Survivors, according to the scattered accounts that exist, were killed, adopted directly into Haudenosaunee communities, as was common Confederacy practice following such conflicts, or scattered outward into other regional nations. And here the trail, much like Karankawa families vanishing quietly into Mexican border communities 2 centuries later, grows genuinely difficult to follow with confidence. Some historians have proposed a connection between Erie refugees and the Westo, a people who appear suddenly and violently in English colonial records along the Savannah River in the 1660s, armed and feared by neighboring nations, before disappearing again within a generation at the hands of the very colonists who had briefly armed them. The proposed link rests more on timing and geographic plausibility than on direct documentary evidence, and remains genuinely contested among historians, who note how easily 2 vanished, thinly documented peoples separated by hundreds of miles might be wrongly stitched together simply because the surviving sources are too sparse to definitively separate them. The physical record compounds rather than resolves this uncertainty. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and western New York contain thousands of documented archaeological sites from this general period, yet locations confidently attributed to the historic Erie remain surprisingly few, their boundaries disputed among archaeologists who continue to debate whether the material culture typically labeled Erie actually represents a single unified nation or several related distinct communities that Jesuit observers simply lack the direct contact to properly distinguish from one another. A problem echoing in its own register the difficulty historians faced separating Acuera identity from the broader Timucuan collapse, or determining how much of Fort Center's construction belonged to the historic Mayaimi, as opposed to earlier, unrelated populations. What the Erie's own account of their war, their homeland, or their understanding of the alliance that doomed them might have contained is, at this distance, entirely unrecoverable. No Nadiver arrived to document a final survivor. No Cormac sat across from a last speaker recording vocabulary before death closed that window permanently, as happened, however incompletely, for the Beothuk and the Chimariko. The Erie's own voice simply never reached any surviving page at all, filtered instead entirely through the observations of missionaries who rarely traveled deep into their territory, and through the oral memory of the Confederacy that destroyed them. Local traditions along Ohio's Lake Erie shoreline still occasionally point toward unexplained earthworks that don't fit neatly into established chronologies for the region's better-studied Adena and Hopewell mound-building cultures, sites whose connection to the Erie themselves, if any exists, remains unconfirmed. Somewhere beneath the cornfields and sandstone bluffs along that southern shoreline, the physical trace of an entire nation may still wait to be properly identified. One final thread in a pattern this exploration has traced across an entire continent of names that outlived the people who carried them, and silences that, centuries later, still have not finished speaking. That unfinished sentence, a silence that, the previous chapter argued, still has not finished speaking, carries, in fact, a direct thread east and south from Erie territory. Because among the peoples the Jesuits mentioned in connection with the Erie's final years, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals, was a nation living not on the Great Lakes at all, but along a river system nearly 200 miles away, one whose name that river still carries today. This is the story of the Susquehannock, of Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic. The Susquehanna River rises in central New York and runs nearly 450 miles south through Pennsylvania and Maryland before emptying into the Chesapeake Bay, the longest river on the Atlantic seaboard, and for much of the 17th century, the territorial spine of a powerful Iroquoian-speaking confederacy. The people who lived along its central and lower stretches called themselves, in their own language, something close to people of the Muddy River. English colonists to the south and Dutch and Swedish traders to the north knew them instead by the name history remembers, Susquehannock. When Captain John Smith sailed up the Chesapeake in 1608, he encountered a people who struck him, by his own account, as remarkably imposing, tall, powerfully built, organized into fortified towns, and clearly a dominant regional power among the surrounding Algonquian-speaking nations, who spoke of the Susquehannock with evident wariness. Smith's resulting map includes one of the earliest European depictions of them, a single warrior drawn deliberately oversized relative to the surrounding figures, a visual choice historians still debate, artistic convention, or genuine reflection of how imposing Smith and his informants actually found them. Archaeology broadly supports that early impression. Excavated town sites in the lower Susquehanna Valley, palisaded and densely populated, positioned defensively along river bluffs, suggest a society organized for both agriculture and sustained conflict, likely numbering several thousand at its height in the early 17th century. Their material culture connects them to the broader Iroquoian world, distant cousins in cultural terms to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of New York, and more distantly still to the Erie, whose destruction closed the previous chapter of this exploration. For decades, the Susquehannock thrived precisely where the fur trade rewarded strength, positioned along a critical corridor between English colonies to the south and Dutch and Swedish posts to the north. That power did not survive the century. Within roughly 30 years, several converging pressures brought it down. Epidemic disease, spread through sustained contact with European traders, cut through Susquehannock towns with the same force it brought to nearly every indigenous nation examined in this series. Continued pressure from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the same confederacy responsible for the Erie's destruction, pushed steadily against Susquehannock territory through the 1670s. and English colonial expansion, particularly aggressive land claims from Maryland and the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1676, left the Susquehannock caught between colonial militias increasingly unwilling to distinguish between hostile and peaceful indigenous communities. By the early 1680s, colonial records describe the Susquehannock as scattered, some absorbed into the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as a subordinate nation, others fleeing south to shelter among the Meherrin and other Virginia and Carolina peoples, still others remaining in small remnant communities along the river bearing their name. Pennsylvania's colonial records mention a group called the Conestoga, generally understood to be Susquehannock descendants settled near present-day Lancaster under William Penn's protection. Their story does not end quietly. In December 1763, a vigilante group known as the Paxton Boys attacked the Conestoga settlement, killing the remaining Susquehannock descendants there, a well-documented atrocity that shocked even many colonial Pennsylvanians, and stands as one of the few starkly clear final chapters in a history otherwise defined by uncertainty. There, the mainstream account largely stops. The questions surrounding it have not. How did a confederacy powerful enough to dominate Chesapeake trade in 1608 fracture so completely within 3 generations? And why does the archaeological record south of Pennsylvania grow so thin so quickly after the 1670s? Some historians have proposed that Susquehannock refugees traveled further than colonial documents explicitly confirm, south into the Carolinas, potentially merging with or becoming indistinguishable from other displaced Iroquoian-speaking peoples navigating that same collapsing world, including, in more speculative readings, the same Westo already raised in connection to the Erie. The evidence remains thin, built more on timing and geography than on direct documentation, and mainstream historians remain divided on how much weight it can bear. Others argue instead that most survivors were simply absorbed into Seneca and other Haudenosaunee communities, their distinct identity gradually dissolving into a larger confederacy rather than persisting independently anywhere at all. The river itself keeps adding detail without resolving the larger picture. 450 miles of it remain only partially surveyed, and in 2021, work near one of the known lower Susquehanna town sites uncovered evidence suggesting occupation patterns slightly different from what earlier excavations had assumed. A small but telling reminder that even a people as comparatively well documented as the Susquehannock still hold back more than they reveal. What did the Susquehannock call themselves in their towns before John Smith's mapmakers gave them a name that would outlast them by centuries? What became of the families who scattered south in the 1670s and simply stopped appearing in any colonial ledger at all? The river still runs the same course it did 400 years ago, cutting through the same bluffs where their fortified towns once stood, carrying perhaps more of that unfinished story beneath its current than any excavation has yet found a way to read. Follow that same Susquehanna south past the Chesapeake, down the Atlantic seaboard, around Florida's peninsula, and west along the Gulf Coast, and the landscape changes entirely. Limestone gives way to karst springs and sinkholes, hardwood bluffs to longleaf pine and wetland, the temperate mid-Atlantic to the humid subtropical Florida panhandle. Here, centered near present-day Tallahassee, lived one of the most formidable and, in some respects, most successfully documented indigenous societies in the entire Southeast, the Apalachee. By the time Spanish explorers first pushed into the region in the 1520s, the Apalachee had already built a densely populated, agriculturally rich province, organized around large earthen mound complexes that had served as centers of political and ceremonial life for generations before any European ship reached the Gulf Coast. The name itself would eventually stretch across an entire mountain range far to the north, misapplied by Spanish and later English cartographers who heard the word from coastal informants and assumed mistakenly that it described a far larger territory than the Apalachee actually controlled. A strange kind of afterlife, not unlike the Susquehannock's river or the Erie's lake, in which a people's name outlives precise knowledge of who they were. The archaeological record shows a society built on remarkably productive maize agriculture, its fields so fertile that Apalachee territory became known, even among rival nations, as a breadbasket of the Southeast. Spanish accounts from Hernando de Soto's brutal 1539 expedition through the region describe fortified towns, disciplined warriors, and a level of political organization that gave de Soto's forces more difficulty than almost any other indigenous nation they encountered on their long, violent march through the interior southeast. The Apalachee were not a peripheral people discovered on history's margins. For a time, they were among the most powerful nations Spain encountered anywhere in North America. That power shaped what came next. Beginning in the 1630s, Spanish Franciscan missionaries established a chain of missions throughout Apalachee territory. And unlike many mission efforts elsewhere in Spanish Florida, this one appears to have taken root with genuine depth. By the mid-17th century, Apalachee province held more mission churches than any other region in Spanish Florida, and Apalachee converts served the Spanish crown as laborers, soldiers, and intermediaries with other indigenous nations. Some historians describe this period as a genuine, if unequal, partnership. The Apalachee, adapting Catholic practice into their own cultural framework while retaining significant autonomy over their towns and internal governance, a blending visible even now in excavated mission sites, where Apalachee-style pottery and traditional building techniques persist alongside church architecture. It could not last. In 1704, an English colonial force from Carolina, allied with Creek and other indigenous warriors hostile to Spanish Florida, launched a devastating campaign against Apalachee province. A sustained military effort now generally known as the Apalachee Massacre, though the term covers weeks of coordinated raids rather than a single event. Mission towns were burned. Thousands of Apalachee were killed, and thousands more taken captive and sold into slavery. Marched north into Carolina in a forced displacement colonial records describe with unsettling bureaucratic calm. Inventories of captives, ledgers of sale, the vocabulary of commerce applied to the dismantling of an entire province within a matter of months. Survivors scattered in nearly every direction the compass allowed. Some fled west toward Spanish-controlled Pensacola and eventually into French Louisiana, where colonial records document small Apalachee refugee communities persisting for decades. Others were absorbed into Creek towns, their identity folding gradually into the larger Creek Confederacy that would later be forcibly removed to Oklahoma in the 19th century, meaning some Apalachee descendants may have walked the Trail of Tears itself, a second displacement layered atop the first. A small community calling itself Apalachee still exists today in Louisiana, tracing its lineage back to those refugees who never returned east, one of the few threads connecting the province de Soto encountered to anyone living now. Yet the record, for all its documentation of the 1704 catastrophe, goes strangely quiet on what followed immediately after. How many Apalachee actually survived the initial raids as opposed to the forced march north? Colonial estimates vary enormously, and modern historians have struggled to reconcile Spanish reports, English captive ledgers, and archaeological evidence of abandoned mission sites into any single reliable number. Some mission locations, thoroughly documented in Spanish administrative records, have never been definitively located by archaeologists at all, their exact positions lost somewhere between colonial cartography and 4 centuries of Florida's shifting, waterlogged terrain. More speculative still is the question of the mound-building tradition itself. Some ceremonial and political centers near present-day Tallahassee show evidence of construction and use, stretching back well before the Apalachee we meet in Spanish records, raising a genuinely unresolved question familiar by now across this entire exploration. How much continuity exists between the deeper mound-building societies of the past and the specific historic era province Spain encountered, and how much has simply been assumed rather than proven? It is a gap the archaeological record has not closed, and may never close without evidence not yet found. What remains, mostly, are the mounds themselves. Quiet, grass-covered, easy to mistake for natural hills, unless you already know to look for them. Somewhere in that Panhandle soil, beneath centuries of pine needles and Florida rain, lie the unexcavated remnants of towns whose names outlasted their people by only a generation or two. What else might still be buried there, waiting for someone to ask the right question of the ground? Nearly 2 centuries would pass between the fall of Apalachee province in the Florida swamps and the final chapter of another people's story, unfolding on the opposite edge of the continent, in the volcanic foothills and steep river canyons of Northern California, where a very different kind of violence would close out one of the most haunting accounts in the entire history of indigenous North America: the story of the Yana. The Yana homeland lay along the eastern side of the Sacramento Valley in the rugged foothill country below Mount Lassen, a landscape of volcanic rock, deep canyons, and swift, cold rivers that cut through terrain far harder to farm and far easier to hide in than the fertile valley floor to the west. The Yana were never a large people, even before contact. Estimates place their pre-contact population somewhere in the low thousands, organized into 4 related but distinct groups sharing a language family found nowhere else on Earth, a linguistic isolate whose closest relatives, if any exist, have never been conclusively identified. They lived by hunting, gathering acorns, and fishing the region's rivers, moving with the seasons through a territory whose steep, broken geography would later prove both their advantage and, ultimately, no protection at all. California's gold rush, beginning in 1848, brought a wave of settlement into Northern California unlike anything the region's indigenous peoples had previously faced. Not the slow, generations-long mission process that had reshaped the Apalachee, but a sudden, overwhelming flood of miners, ranchers, and settlers arriving within a matter of years, most operating far outside any effective government oversight. What followed, historians now generally agree, constitutes one of the most concentrated campaigns of violence against indigenous peoples in American history. State-sanctioned militias, private vigilante groups, and individual ranchers conducted a sustained series of massacres against California's native population throughout the 1850s and 1860s, actions that some contemporary scholars and, more recently, the state of California itself have formally characterized as genocide. The Yana were among the hardest hit. Settler accounts and later historical research describe a series of massacres throughout the 1860s, specifically targeting Yana communities, retaliatory raids following isolated incidents of cattle theft or settler deaths, expanded into indiscriminate campaigns against entire villages, including women, children, and the elderly. By the early 1870s, the Yana as a functioning society had been almost entirely destroyed. Population estimates for the surviving Yana by 1872 run as low as the low dozens, a staggering collapse from an already modest pre-contact population, achieved within roughly 2 decades. And then, for nearly 40 years, the historical record simply assumed the Yana were gone entirely. Anthropologists studying California's indigenous peoples in the late 19th century listed the Yana, and particularly the southernmost subgroup known as the Yahi, as extinct, a closed chapter, mourned briefly in academic literature, and then set aside. That assumption held until the morning of August 29, 1911, when a starving, exhausted man walked out of the foothills near Oroville, California, and into the yard of a slaughterhouse on the edge of town. He spoke no English, wore no clothing recognizable to the ranchers who found him, and appeared, by every account, to be entirely alone. Local authorities, uncertain what else to do, took him into custody. Word reached the University of California, and anthropologists Alfred Kroeber and Thomas Waterman arrived to find something they had believed impossible: a living member of the Yahi Yana, presumed extinct for decades, standing in front of them. He came to be known as Ishi, a name Kroeber gave him, meaning simply man in the Yana language, since Yahi custom forbade a person from speaking their own name aloud without another Yahi present to say it for them. And by then, there was no one left. Ishi spent the remaining 5 years of his life living at the University of California's museum in San Francisco, working with anthropologists to document Yahi language, technology, and oral tradition before dying of tuberculosis in 1916. The last fully documented speaker of his people's language, and, by most historical accounts, among the very last of the Yahi to have lived entirely outside of settler contact. What happened during those hidden decades between the massacres of the 1860s and Ishi's emergence in 1911 remains, even now, only partially understood. Later research, particularly by anthropologist Theodora Kroeber, pieced together evidence suggesting that a small handful of Yahi survivors, Ishi's own family among them, lived in complete concealment for roughly 2 decades, deliberately avoiding all contact with the surrounding settler population, moving through terrain they knew intimately enough to remain essentially invisible. How many others might have done the same, in territory just as remote, and simply never emerged at all? The historical record cannot say. More unsettling still is the question of Ishi's remains. Following his death, his brain was removed during autopsy, against the wishes of Kroeber himself, who had explicitly asked that no such procedure take place, and sent to the Smithsonian Institution, where it remained largely forgotten in storage for nearly 90 years. Only after sustained advocacy in the late 1990s was it identified, and in 2000, finally returned and reunited with his cremated remains for burial, according to Yahi tradition. A resolution that arrived roughly a century after his death, and only through considerable effort to locate what institutional records had allowed to disappear. The foothills below Mount Lassen remain much as they were. Volcanic rock, deep canyon shadow, rivers running cold through the country that hid a family from the outside world for 2 decades without a single confirmed sighting. What else moved through that landscape during those hidden years, unrecorded and unremembered? And how many stories like Ishi's, a people declared extinct, only to prove otherwise, never found their own moment to walk out of the hills? Ishi's brain, forgotten in a Smithsonian drawer for nearly 90 years before anyone thought to ask where it had gone. That same pattern of institutional neglect, of remains and record alike left to disappear simply because no one made preserving them a priority, resurfaces on Florida's Gulf Coast in the story of a people whose ceremonial mounds still rise quietly from some of the most heavily developed real estate in the American South, the Tocobaga of Tampa Bay. Long before Tampa Bay held a city of that name, it held the Tocobaga, a people who built their world around the bay's rich estuarine waters rather than around agriculture. Unlike the maize-cultivating Apalachee to the north, the Tocobaga drew their sustenance primarily from the bay itself. Fish, shellfish, and the abundant marine life of one of the most productive estuaries on the Gulf Coast, supplemented by limited farming and foraging across the surrounding pine flatwoods. This maritime economy supported a society organized around large earthwork complexes, the most significant of which stood at the head of Old Tampa Bay, near present-day Safety Harbor, giving archaeologists the name they now use for this entire regional culture, the Safety Harbor tradition. The largest of these sites, known today as the Safety Harbor Mounds, or Filapo Park after the land's later owner, remains partially intact. A temple mound roughly 20 feet high, built up in stages over generations, once the ceremonial and political heart of a chiefdom that, by Spanish accounts, controlled the bay and commanded respect, and occasionally tribute, from smaller communities scattered around its shores. Spanish explorers, beginning with the Narvaez expedition in 1528 and continuing through decades of contact afterward, described a paramount chief presiding over the region from that central mound complex, a level of political consolidation that placed the Tocobaga among the more organized chiefdoms Spain encountered along Florida's Gulf Coast. The Spanish presence itself proved characteristically brief and characteristically destructive. A short-lived Jesuit mission attempt in the 1560s collapsed within months amid conflict with the Tocobaga leadership, and unlike the deep, sustained mission network eventually established among the Apalachee further north, Spanish Florida never achieved anything resembling lasting institutional control over Tampa Bay. What replaced formal colonization was something slower and, in the end, no less final. Sporadic contact with Spanish ships, sufficient to introduce Old World disease into a population with no immunity, but insufficient to leave the kind of detailed documentary record that survives for other Florida chiefdoms. By the early 18th century, the same period in which the Apalachee to the north were being scattered by Carolina raiders, the Tocobaga as a distinct society had effectively ceased to exist. Not through a single documented massacre or forced removal, but through a slower, less legible collapse driven primarily by epidemic disease, outmigration, and absorption into other remnant groups. A process modern historians can trace only in outline, through gaps rather than through direct testimony. This is, in some respects, the quietest kind of disappearance in the historical record. No single dramatic event for chroniclers to describe in detail, no captive ledgers, no massacre reports. Which raises a genuine question for anyone trying to reconstruct what happened here. How does a regional power, one substantial enough to command a Spanish explorer's respect in 1528, simply fade from the documentary record within 2 centuries, leaving behind mounds but comparatively little narrative? Some historians argue the answer lies simply in Spanish Florida's chronic lack of administrative attention to the Gulf Coast compared to the more heavily documented St. Augustine and Apalachee regions. Others note that Tocobaga remnants likely merged with other South Florida groups, including the Calusa to the south, whose own better documented history may have absorbed and obscured Tocobaga identity within it, making the two peoples increasingly difficult for later observers and later historians to distinguish. The mounds themselves have carried their own unsettling history since. 19th and early 20th century development around Tampa Bay saw numerous shell and earthwork sites bulldozed for construction, their contents, including human remains, scattered or destroyed with little documentation. The same institutional carelessness, in a different register, that once left Ishie's own remains forgotten in storage for nearly a century. Philippe Park's mound survives largely because Odette Philippe, the estate's 19th century owner, chose preservation over demolition. But archaeologists studying Tampa Bay have long acknowledged that far more sites were lost than saved, their evidence gone before serious scientific excavation ever reached them. What did those destroyed mounds hold? What record of Tocobaga political history, religious practice, or daily life vanished under a bulldozer blade before anyone thought to ask? Even the surviving mound raises questions archaeologists have not fully resolved. Radiocarbon and ceramic evidence suggests the Safety Harbor site saw continuous use and rebuilding across several centuries. But the full sequence of that construction and the precise nature of the rituals conducted atop it remain only partially reconstructed from artifact scatter and comparison with better documented Mississippian mound traditions further north and west. Whether the Tocobaga's ceremonial practices developed independently along the Gulf Coast, or arrived through contact and exchange with those broader mound-building traditions, is a question current evidence can suggest, but not conclusively settle. Today, the mound at Philippi Park sits quietly within a public green space, joggers and picnickers passing within yards of a structure that once stood at the political center of an entire chiefdom, most walking by with no particular awareness of what the rise in the ground beneath their feet represents. Tampa Bay itself, dredged, developed, and reshaped over more than a century of urban growth, has swallowed most physical trace of the smaller Tocobaga settlements that once ringed its shore. What remains buried beneath the city that replaced them? And what might still surface the next time a construction crew breaks ground somewhere along that ancient waterline? Follow that same Gulf shoreline west, past the Florida Panhandle, past the mouth of the Mississippi, into the marshes and bayous where Louisiana dissolves into Texas, along a coast that barely distinguishes between land and water. Here, in the deltas and prairie wetlands stretching from the Atchafalaya Basin to the Sabine River and beyond, lived a people whose very name carries one of the more unsettling labels in North American ethnography: the Atakapa, a word not of their own making, but one given to them by neighboring Choctaw speakers, meaning, roughly, eaters of men. Whether that name reflected genuine practice, isolated wartime custom exaggerated into permanent reputation, or simple intertribal rivalry expressed through the harshest insult available, remains, even now, a matter of real scholarly disagreement. And it is worth sitting with that uncertainty rather than rushing past it. What is documented, through both archaeological evidence and the accounts of later ethnographers who worked directly with surviving Atakapa speakers, is that instances of ritual cannibalism connected to warfare did occur among various Gulf Coast peoples during this period, a practice attested, in varying forms, among several regional groups and not unique to any single nation. Whether it was practiced with any more frequency among the Atakapa than among their neighbors, or whether the name simply stuck to them more permanently, is difficult to establish with confidence from the sources that survive. Set that question aside, and what remains is a people who called themselves, in their own language, something closer to the people, as so many nations across the continent did, and who built a distinctive way of life around the resources of the Gulf coastal marshes. Fishing, hunting alligator and waterfowl, gathering shellfish from the brackish estuaries, and moving seasonally between the coast and slightly higher inland prairie as conditions demanded. Linguistically, the Atakapa language stood almost entirely alone, a linguistic isolate, like Yana far to the west, sharing no clear, uncontested relationship with any neighboring language family, a fact that has long intrigued linguists trying to trace the deeper history of Gulf Coast populations. Some researchers have proposed a distant Gulf language grouping connecting Atakapa to languages like Chitimacha, Tunica, and Muskogean tongues. The proposal remains debated, accepted by some linguists, and treated with real skepticism by others. The underlying relationships, if any exist, still not conclusively demonstrated. French colonial contact, beginning in the early 18th century as France established Louisiana, brought the familiar pattern. Epidemic disease moving ahead of and alongside formal settlement, trade relationships that reshaped local power dynamics, and a slow but steady loss of territory as European and later American settlement expanded along the coast and up the river systems. Unlike the sudden, documented catastrophe that struck the Apalachee in a matter of weeks, or the concentrated massacre campaigns that nearly erased the Yana within 2 decades, the Atakapa's decline unfolded gradually across more than a century, tracked unevenly through French and Spanish colonial censuses, occasional missionary reports, and later American territorial records. A slow attrition rather than a single documented catastrophe, which paradoxically makes it harder, not easier, to say with precision what was lost and when. By the early 19th century, colonial and territorial records describe Atakapa communities as significantly diminished and increasingly dispersed, some remaining along the Louisiana coast near present-day Lake Charles, others scattered into East Texas, their populations reduced by disease and absorbed, in various documented instances, into other regional communities including Choctaw, Coushatta, and Creole populations formed through generations of intermarriage along the Gulf Coast. And here the trail grows notably thin. 19th century American ethnographers, arriving relatively late to document the Atakapa in any systematic way, found only scattered remnant communities and a rapidly diminishing number of fluent speakers. Linguist John Swanton's early 20th century fieldwork, along with earlier work by Albert Gatchett in the 1880s, managed to record substantial vocabulary and grammatical material from the last known fluent Atakapa speakers before the language passed out of active use entirely. A preservation effort that arrived, as it so often does in these stories, at nearly the last possible moment. What those linguistic records cannot fully recover is everything the language once carried beyond its vocabulary. The full body of oral tradition, origin narratives, and historical memory that a living language transmits across generations, most of which had likely already been lost or fragmented by the time Gatchett and Swanton began their work. How much of Atakapa cosmology, political history, and self-understanding disappeared in the century between French contact and those late salvage recordings? The word list survives. The context that once gave those words their full meaning is largely gone. More speculative and considerably harder to verify are the questions surrounding Atakapa continuity into the present. Descendant communities and organizations in both Louisiana and Texas today claim Atakapa heritage, tracing family lines back through the documented remnant communities of the 19th century, though as with so many Gulf Coast peoples whose populations were reduced and dispersed rather than destroyed outright, establishing clear, continuous documentation across the generations of intermarriage, migration, and incomplete record-keeping presents real genealogical and historical challenges. Challenges that descendant communities themselves are often working actively to address through their own research and oral history projects. The marshes and bayous of the western Gulf Coast remain, in their own way, as resistant to easy investigation as they were 4 centuries ago. Waterlogged, shifting, reluctant to preserve much of anything for long. Shell middens and scattered habitation sites still turn up along the Louisiana and Texas coastline, most never systematically excavated, many likely already lost to erosion and rising water before archaeologists reach them. What remains submerged out there, in the marsh mud and brackish water, waiting for a receding tide or a construction project to finally bring it back into the light. That same receding tide, uncovering shell and midden along a shifting Gulf shoreline, has an inland counterpart. Not salt water retreating from a marsh, but fresh water rising and falling across a vast, shallow lake at the heart of the Florida peninsula. A lake whose ancient shoreline shell mounds have been yielding their own secrets for well over a century. This is Lake Okeechobee, and the people who lived along its shores before Spanish contact are known to history by a name borrowed directly from the water itself: the Mayaimi. Lake Okeechobee is Florida's largest freshwater lake, a shallow, sprawling body of water roughly 730 square miles in extent, fed by the Kissimmee River from the north and historically draining slowly southward into what became the Everglades. Spanish explorers and chroniclers, working from information gathered through indigenous informants and other native intermediaries, recorded the name of both the lake and its people as some variation of Mayaimi, a word later chroniclers connected to a native term meaning, roughly, big water, and which, through a long chain of linguistic transmission, colonial record-keeping, and eventual application to a Spanish mission and settlement far to the southeast, ultimately gave its name to the modern city of Miami, a connection most visitors to that city have likely never considered. The Mayaimi themselves left a comparatively thin documentary record, even by the standards of Florida's other lost peoples. What we know comes primarily from Spanish sources, particularly the account of Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, a Spanish castaway who lived among various South Florida indigenous groups for roughly 17 years during the mid-16th century after being shipwrecked as a young man, and who later wrote one of the few first-hand European descriptions of the region's native peoples before their populations collapsed. Fontaneda described the Mayaimi as living around the lake that bore their name, subsisting substantially on the lake's abundant freshwater fish and on kawanti, a starchy root processed from the native zamaya plant, a laborious food preparation process requiring the removal of naturally occurring toxins before consumption. Evidence, in itself, of accumulated ecological knowledge refined across many generations of habitation around that single lake. Archaeological evidence supports a longer and more complex history than Fontaneda's brief account alone suggests. Shell and earthwork mounds around Lake Okeechobee's periphery, along with the notable Fort Center site on the lake's western edge, reveal occupation stretching back well over 2,000 years, with evidence of increasingly complex mound construction, earthwork engineering, and what some archaeologists have interpreted as ceremonial or possibly astronomically aligned features developed over many centuries. Fort Center itself has produced some of the more genuinely puzzling archaeological evidence in the region. Large circular earthworks, an artificial pond apparently constructed for agricultural or ceremonial purposes, and animal effigy carvings whose full ritual significance remains only partially understood, debated among archaeologists who have worked the site since serious excavation began there in the 1960s. How much of that earlier, deeper mound-building tradition connects directly to the Mayaimi people Fontaneda described in the 1560s, as opposed to earlier, culturally distinct populations who simply occupied the same advantageous lakeside territory across many centuries? This is a genuinely open question in South Florida archaeology, complicated by the same problem that recurs throughout this region's history. Continuity of place does not necessarily mean continuity of people, and the material record alone cannot always distinguish between a single culture evolving over 2,000 years and a sequence of different peoples inheriting the same favorable landscape in turn. What is better documented is the Mayaimi's fate after Spanish contact, which followed the familiar and devastating pattern established elsewhere along Florida's coasts and interior. Epidemic disease moving well ahead of any sustained colonial presence. Population collapse tracked only unevenly through sparse Spanish records, and eventual absorption into or displacement by neighboring groups, likely including the more thoroughly documented Calusa, whose considerable regional power by the 17th century appears to have extended influence over smaller interior peoples like the Mayaimi. By the early 18th century, as Spanish Florida itself began to destabilize under pressure from English colonial expansion and Creek and Yamasee raiding parties pushing down from the north, the Mayaimi as a distinct, named people effectively disappear from the historical record entirely. No massacre account, no forced removal, simply an absence where a name used to be. The lake itself has changed dramatically since then, reshaped by more than a century of drainage projects, agricultural development, and the massive Herbert Hoover Dike encircling much of its shoreline, engineering interventions that have fundamentally altered the water levels, flow patterns, and surrounding wetland ecology the Mayaimi would have known. How many archaeological sites along that original shoreline have been submerged, drained, or destroyed by this modern re-engineering before they were ever properly documented? Florida's own state archaeological records acknowledge significant, irreversible losses to sites throughout the Lake Okeechobee Basin, casualties of drainage and development that occurred well before modern preservation law existed to slow them down. Fort Center's animal effigies and circular earthworks remain among the most enigmatic constructions in the southeastern United States, still generating scholarly debate about their precise function and meaning more than 60 years after formal excavation began. What did those structures mean to the people who built and maintained them across so many generations? And how much of that meaning departed with the Mayaimi themselves, taken into an absence the record can name but never quite explain? Somewhere beneath the levees and cane fields ringing Lake Okeechobee's modern shoreline, the lake that gave a distant city its name may still be holding the rest of that story back. An absence the record can name but never quite explain. That same phrase could describe a dozen peoples already examined in this exploration, and it applies once more on California's central coast, in the rugged terrain around present-day Big Sur and Monterey, where a small and little-known people called the Esselen lived in territory so isolated, so hemmed in by mountains and sea, that they may have preserved something genuinely rare, a linguistic and cultural identity that survived, in fragments, longer than almost anyone expected. The Esselen homeland occupied a narrow stretch of California's central coast, bounded by the rugged Santa Lucia Mountains to the east and the Pacific to the west, centered roughly around the Big Sur coastline and extending inland toward the Upper Carmel and Arroyo Seco valleys. It was, by most accounts, one of the smallest linguistic groups in pre-contact California, likely numbering in the range of a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 people at most, organized into small, scattered communities that relied on acorn gathering, fishing, and hunting across a landscape whose sheer topographic difficulty, steep canyons, dense chaparral, a coastline offering little easy anchorage, may have helped keep them relatively isolated from neighboring peoples for generations. That isolation ended with the arrival of the Spanish mission system in the late 18th century. Mission San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo, founded in 1770 and relocated to its permanent site the following year, and later Mission Soledad, founded in 1791, drew Esselen people into the Spanish mission economy along with members of neighboring Olón-speaking communities, a process that, as with so many California missions, combined religious conversion with forced labor, disrupted subsistence patterns, and exposure to European disease, against which indigenous Californians had no immunity. Mission records, baptismal, marriage, and death registers kept with Spanish bureaucratic thoroughness, became, unintentionally, one of the primary surviving sources documenting Esselen individuals and family lines. A paper record created for entirely different purposes that later historians and Esselen descendants alike would come to rely on for reconstructing a history the missions themselves had done so much to unravel. By the time California passed from Spanish to Mexican and then American control across the first half of the 19th century, The Esselen population had been reduced dramatically, and the language itself faced a crisis shared by dozens of California's indigenous tongues. A rapidly shrinking pool of fluent speakers, most of them elderly, with younger generations increasingly raised within the mixed Spanish-influenced communities that formed around former mission settlements. Linguist and ethnographer Alfred Kroeber, the same Kroeber who would later work with Ishi at the University of California decades afterward, described Esselen in the early 20th century as extinct, or nearly so, based on the absence of any known living fluent speakers by the time systematic linguistic documentation began in earnest. And for much of the 20th century that assessment held, largely unchallenged. Esselen appeared in academic literature as one of California's vanished languages, known only through limited vocabulary lists recorded by earlier observers, including some material gathered in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, by mission-era priests, and later compiled by researchers working from fragmentary, sometimes contradictory sources. Compared to the richly documented Yahi language Kroeber and his colleagues recorded directly from Ishi, Esselen survived on paper as little more than scattered word lists, a language known to have existed, but barely known at all in its living form. What complicates this picture, and what has driven considerable scholarly and community effort in recent decades, is the persistence of Esselen descendant communities themselves, who never accepted the extinct label applied to their ancestors, and who have worked, particularly since the late 20th century, to document genealogical continuity back through mission records to Esselen ancestors, and to support linguistic revitalization efforts drawing on the surviving vocabulary lists and comparative work with related language reconstructions. In 2020, the Esselen tribe of Monterey County achieved a milestone with real historical weight: the purchase of over 1,000 acres of ancestral land near Big Sur, the first time in over 250 years that Esselen people held formal title to a piece of their own homeland. A moment that arrived not through any dramatic discovery, but through sustained patient work reconstructing a documented lineage across 2.5 centuries of mission records, land grants, and family history. Yet real uncertainty remains, and scholars are honest about its extent. How complete is the surviving vocabulary relative to what a fully living Esselen language once contained? Comparative linguists have long debated Esselen's relationship to neighboring language families, with some proposing distant connections to the broader Hokan language grouping found elsewhere in California, a hypothesis that, like the proposed Gulf language connection suggested for Atakapa, remains genuinely contested rather than settled. And archaeologically, the Big Sur coastline and Santa Lucia foothills hold numerous sites: shell middens, habitation areas, rock art panels of uncertain age and origin scattered through the region's canyons, that have never received the kind of sustained excavation and analysis given to better-funded, more accessible archaeological regions elsewhere in the state. The rugged terrain that once isolated and perhaps protected the Esselen continues, in its own way, to guard its secret still. Steep, largely undeveloped, much of it now within protected wilderness and parkland that limits both casual disturbance and systematic study alike. What remains recorded only in a scatter of 18th century mission vocabulary, waiting for some future comparison or discovery to fill in what was lost. And what might still lie undisturbed in those Santa Lucia canyons, in terrain that has kept its distance from serious archaeological attention for longer than almost anywhere else on the California coast. Cold water again, but moving faster now. A narrow whitewater river cutting through granite and shale instead of a coastal lagoon or an inland lake, climbing north from Big Sur into the Klamath Mountains of far northern California, where the Trinity River carves a canyon through some of the most rugged country in the state. It was here, along a stretch of river barely 30 miles long, that one of North America's smallest and most obscure documented peoples lived: the Chimariko. Small is not an exaggeration in this case. Ethnographic estimates place the pre-contact Chimariko population at perhaps a few hundred people at most, confined almost entirely to a narrow corridor along the Trinity River between what are now the towns of Burnt Ranch and the area near the New River's confluence, a territory so compact that some later researchers have questioned how a distinct language and culture managed to persist there at all, hemmed in as it was by larger, more populous neighboring peoples on nearly every side. Shasta to the northeast, Hupa to the west, Wintu to the south. Like Yana and Esselen before it in this exploration, Chimariko has long been classified as a linguistic isolate, or at best a distant, uncertain member of a broader and still debated Hokan language grouping stretching across parts of California. Its closest linguistic relatives, if any genuinely exist, never conclusively identified despite more than a century of comparative work. The Trinity River Canyon itself may explain part of the puzzle. Steep, narrow, and difficult to traverse, the Chimariko homeland occupied a kind of geographic bottleneck, terrain that offered limited agricultural potential but rich salmon runs and hunting grounds, sufficient to sustain a small population indefinitely, while also perhaps providing enough natural isolation to preserve a distinct language and identity across many generations, protected less by numbers than by the sheer difficulty of the ground itself. It is the same pattern seen already with the Yana in the volcanic foothills below Mount Lassen and the Esselen in the folds of the Santa Lucia Range. Difficult terrain correlating again and again across northern and central California, with linguistic isolates that outlasted their more accessible, more populous neighbors' expectations of them. That protection ended decisively and quickly with the discovery of gold in the Trinity River drainage in the early 1850s. The same wave of mining and settlement that devastated the Yana further south arrived in Chimariko territory with comparable force, and the documentary record here follows a grimly familiar arc. Violent conflict between miners and Chimariko communities defending their remaining territory, punitive militia expeditions, and a population collapse so severe and so rapid that by the 1870s, ethnographers working in the region already described the Chimariko as nearly gone, their numbers reduced from a few hundred to, by some accounts, fewer than a dozen individuals within roughly 2 decades of sustained contact. What follows is where the Chimariko story grows genuinely difficult to pin down with confidence. Unlike Ishi's dramatic emergence from the Yahi foothills in 1911, the last fluent Chimariko speakers did not step forward into any comparable moment of public discovery. Instead, the language and its final speakers faded from the ethnographic record more quietly, documented mainly through the fieldwork of linguists including Roland Dixon in the early 20th century, and later Jaime de Angulo, who worked with a small handful of surviving elderly speakers to record what vocabulary, grammar, and oral tradition they could before those individuals died. De Angulo's own field notes, by his own account, described difficulty locating even a small number of speakers by the 1920s, and later linguists working in subsequent decades were unable to locate any fluent speakers at all, meaning the window during which any systematic documentation of the language was even possible closed by roughly the mid-20th century, leaving Chimariko preserved almost entirely through a handful of researchers' notebooks, rather than through any broader institutional record. This raises a question that echoes something already asked about the Esselen. How much of the Chimariko language and the oral history, cosmology, and daily life it once carried survived into those final fieldwork sessions? And how much had already been lost in the 60-odd years between the gold rush violence of the 1850s and de Angulo's fieldwork in the 1920s. Unlike Ishi, who lived largely apart from settler society until 1911, and therefore, however tragically, preserved a great deal of undiluted cultural knowledge for Kroeber and Waterman to record, the last Chimariko speakers had lived through decades of disruption, displacement, and integration into surrounding communities well before any linguist arrived to ask them what they remembered. The material that survives may represent only a fraction of what once existed, and there is, at this distance, no clear way to measure how large that missing fraction actually is. Archaeological attention to the Trinity River Canyon itself has remained comparatively limited, constrained by the same rugged terrain that once sheltered the Chimariko, and by the remote, sparsely populated character of the region even today. Sites likely remain undocumented along stretches of River Canyon that have seen little systematic survey, protected in a sense that recalls the Esselen's Santa Lucia canyons, more by inaccessibility than by any deliberate preservation effort. The Trinity River still runs through that same narrow canyon, cold and fast, past salmon runs diminished but not entirely gone, past terrain that kept a small, distinct people isolated and intact for who knows how many centuries before it could no longer protect them at all. What did those final Chimariko speakers choose not to share with the linguists who came looking, whether by omission, by forgetting, or by simple exhaustion? And what remains even now folded into that difficult ground, waiting for a story no one is left to tell? Jaime de Angulo, chasing the last speakers of a vanishing Trinity River language in the 1920s, was hardly the first outsider to arrive too late and record too little. Nearly 4 centuries earlier, on Florida's opposite coast, that same story of documentation arriving at the 11th hour had already played out once, through the eyes of shipwrecked Spanish sailors who found themselves unwillingly among a people the Spanish crown would come to fear and rely on in equal measure: the AIs of Florida's Atlantic shore. The AIs controlled a stretch of Florida's east coast centered roughly around the Indian River Lagoon, near present-day Vero Beach, territory that placed them directly astride one of the most treacherous stretches of coastline in the Spanish colonial world. The Gulf Stream runs close to shore along this section of Florida, and for 2.5 centuries it carried Spanish treasure fleets north from Havana toward Europe, fleets that hurricanes and navigational error periodically threw onto the shoals and reefs just offshore, spilling survivors, cargo, and occasionally staggering quantities of silver and gold directly into AIS territory. The 1715 treasure fleet disaster, in which a hurricane destroyed 11 Spanish ships along this very coast, remains the most famous of these events, but it was only the largest in a long pattern the AIs had already learned to navigate generations before European ships ever arrived with any regularity. What emerged from this geography was a wrecking economy, unlike almost anything else documented among Florida's indigenous peoples. The AIs, according to Spanish accounts, actively salvaged wrecked ships along their coastline, recovering cargo, and in numerous documented instances, taking Spanish castaways captive, sometimes for ransom, sometimes for labor, sometimes, according to later accounts, integrating survivors into AIS communities for extended periods. This was precisely the position in which Hernando de Escalante Fontaneda, the same shipwrecked chronicler whose account illuminated the Miami's history around Lake Okeechobee, spent significant time moving among several South Florida peoples, including the AIs, during his roughly 17 years of captivity, before eventually returning to Spain and writing one of the very few detailed European first-hand accounts of the region's indigenous societies prior to their collapse. Fontaneda's account, along with later Spanish colonial records, describes the AIs as a comparatively small but formidable coastal chiefdom, subsisting substantially on fishing and shellfish gathering from the rich Indian River Lagoon estuary, supplemented by hunting and limited plant gathering, without the intensive agriculture practiced by inland Florida peoples like the Apalachee. Politically, Spanish sources describe a paramount chief commanding real authority over the region, sufficient to negotiate directly, and at times contentiously, with Spanish colonial officials over salvage rights, captive ransoms, and trade terms, a level of leverage remarkable for a coastal people whose population likely never numbered more than a few thousand at its height. That leverage came to a formal, if uneasy, resolution in 1605, when Spanish authorities established a short-lived mission and trading post among the AIs, an arrangement that persisted intermittently for decades, shaped as much by the ongoing salvage economy as by any genuine missionary success. Unlike the deep, sustained mission network eventually built among the Apalachee to the northwest, Spanish influence among the AIs remained comparatively light and inconsistent, a relationship defined less by conversion than by mutual wary transaction along a genuinely dangerous stretch of coastline that neither side fully controlled. The AIS population, like nearly every indigenous nation encountered in this exploration, began a steady decline through the 17th century, driven by epidemic disease introduced through sustained Spanish contact, though the documentary record here grows notably thinner than for better studied Florida peoples. By the early 18th century, as English colonial raiders from Carolina pushed devastating campaigns down the Florida peninsula, the same broader wave of violence that had already destroyed Apalachee province, The AIs faced increasing pressure from slave raids and displacement alongside the disease that had already reduced their numbers substantially. Surviving accounts describe remnant AIs communities relocating southward, some eventually reaching Spanish Cuba alongside other South Florida refugee groups when Spain formally ceded Florida to Britain in 1763, a mass evacuation that effectively closed the historical chapter on several of Florida's remaining indigenous coastal peoples at once. What happened to those refugees who reached Cuba, and whether any distinct AI's identity persisted there across subsequent generations of Cuban colonial history, remains a genuinely underexplored question, one that Cuban archival records could potentially illuminate further, but which has received comparatively little dedicated scholarly attention to date. And on the Florida side of that migration, the archaeological record along the Indian River Lagoon still holds material the historical record cannot fully explain. Extensive shell-midden complexes, including large mound sites near present-day Vero Beach and further south, some showing occupation stretching back thousands of years before the AIS chiefdom Fontaneda described, raising the same recurring question posed already about Fort Center and the Mayaimi. How much continuity connects the deep pre-contact mound-building history of this coastline to the specific historic era people's Spanish sources labeled A's? And how much remains simply assumed rather than demonstrated? Modern development along the Indian River Lagoon has claimed a significant number of these sites over the past century, even as others remain protected within state parks and preserves, their full contents still not comprehensively excavated or documented. Somewhere along that same reef-strewn coastline that once wrecked Spanish treasure fleets with such grim regularity, the physical record of the people who salvaged those wrecks, ransomed their sailors, and negotiated as equals with a colonial empire may still lie waiting, beneath the same shifting sands that swallowed so much Spanish silver and gave so little of it back. Shifting sands that swallow far more than they give back. That same image, closing the AI's story on Florida's Atlantic coast, could describe an entire pattern this exploration keeps returning to. A name born from accusation, a practice debated ever since as slander, wartime exception, or something more central to identity. That question, raised once already regarding the Atakapa of the Gulf Coast, resurfaces further west, on the plains and hill country of Texas, attached to a people whose reputation would eventually contribute to one of the most brutal episodes of vigilante violence in the American West, the Tonkawa. The Tonkawa homeland, at the time of earliest sustained European contact, stretched across central Texas, a transitional zone between the eastern woodlands and the open plains, territory the Tonkawa occupied as skilled hunters, particularly of bison, supplementing that hunting with gathering and limited horticulture as conditions allowed. Unlike many of the peoples examined so far in this exploration, the Tonkawa were never conquered by disease and colonial contact into quiet disappearance. Their story instead is one of sustained, active resistance and adaptation across nearly 2 centuries of shifting frontiers: Spanish, then Mexican, then the Republic of Texas, then the United States. Each new power bringing new pressures, and the Tonkawa meeting most of them directly. Linguistically, Tonkawa occupies a position familiar by now in this series. A language isolate, or at best a distant and contested member of a broader hypothesized grouping, its precise relationship to neighboring Texas and Plains languages, never conclusively established despite considerable linguistic study. Some researchers have proposed loose connections to other regional isolates. The evidence remains thin enough that most linguists today simply classify Tonkawa as standing alone, one language family reduced eventually to a single people, and that people reduced in turn to a strikingly small population by the 20th century. The reputation of Tonkawa cannibalism, much like the accusation carried by the Atakapa name centuries earlier and hundreds of miles to the east, is documented in historical sources, but remains genuinely contested in its scope and meaning. 19th century American accounts, including some describing Tonkawa scouts serving alongside United States and Texas military forces, reference ritual cannibalism practiced in specific wartime contexts, particularly connected to the consumption of the flesh of defeated enemies as an act tied to Tonkawa spiritual and warrior tradition, rather than to subsistence. Whether this practice was accurately understood and proportionately represented by the American observers who recorded it, or whether it was exaggerated and sensationalized in ways that served later purposes, is a question historians continue to weigh carefully, aware that such accusations, across many cultures and centuries, have often been wielded selectively against groups already targeted for other reasons. That reputation, whatever its underlying accuracy, would have devastating consequences. Throughout the mid-19th century, the Tonkawa found themselves in an unusually difficult position. Traditionally hostile toward the powerful Comanche and other plains groups who had displaced them from portions of their territory generations earlier, the Tonkawa increasingly allied themselves with Texan and American forces, serving as scouts and auxiliary fighters in campaigns against the very Comanche and Kiowa bands who remained their traditional enemies. This alliance offered a measure of protection and purpose through the Texas Republic and early statehood period, but it also placed the Tonkawa in a precarious and ultimately dangerous position once the Civil War fractured the frontier's already unstable balance of power. In October 1862, that precarious position collapsed into catastrophe. A coalition of Delaware, Shawnee, and other indigenous fighters, allied with Confederate sympathies and acting amid the chaos of the Civil War's opening years on the frontier, attacked the Tonkawa encampment near the Wichita Agency in present-day Oklahoma, where the Tonkawa had been relocated. The resulting massacre, now generally known as the Tonkawa Massacre, killed a substantial portion of the entire tribe in a single event. Estimates suggest well over half the Tonkawa population present was killed that day, a catastrophic single-event loss comparable in proportion, though not in method, to the concentrated massacre campaigns that had devastated the Yana in California within roughly the same historical era. Some accounts connect the ferocity of that attack directly to the Tonkawa's reputation among rival tribes as consumers of enemy flesh, and to lingering resentment over their alliance with American and Texan forces against fellow indigenous nations. A motive historians treat as plausible, but given the fragmentary nature of surviving accounts from multiple conflicting parties, not fully verifiable in its precise weighting. The Tonkawa who survived 1862 were relocated multiple times over the following decades, eventually settling on a reservation in north-central Oklahoma near present-day Tonkawa, Oklahoma, where a small, federally recognized tribe persists today, meaning that, unlike several peoples already discussed in this exploration, the Tonkawa story does not end in disappearance, but in survival at a drastically reduced scale, their population by the early 20th century numbering only in the low hundreds, a demographic collapse from which the tribe has only partially recovered across the generations since. What remains genuinely uncertain, even with a living tribal community able to speak to their own history in ways the Erie, Mayaimi, or Ayis no longer can, is the deeper pre-contact history of the Tonkawa people themselves. Archaeological evidence for the central Texas region shows extensive human habitation stretching back thousands of years, but connecting that long archaeological sequence definitively to the specific historic Tonkawa nation, as opposed to earlier, culturally distinct populations who occupied the same advantageous hunting grounds before them, remains difficult. The same continuity problem that has recurred throughout this exploration, from Fort Center's earthworks to the Ayas shell middens of Florida's Atlantic coast. The Tonkawa language itself, though extensively documented by linguists working with speakers in the early and mid-20th century, including notable fieldwork by Harry Hoyger in the 1930s, no longer has any known living fluent speakers, its last native speakers having passed within living memory of some tribal members alive today. A loss that arrived, unlike so many stories in this series, not through catastrophe or vanishing, but simply through the slow, ordinary erosion of generational transmission, even as the tribe itself endures. What does it mean for a people to survive, formally and legally, while the language that once carried their deepest understanding of themselves falls permanently silent? And what remains, in central Texas hill country and along the Oklahoma plains, of the deeper story that even the Tonkawa's own surviving oral tradition may no longer fully reach? That falling silence, a language surviving formally in tribal record but with no living voice left to speak it, carries a strange echo forward into a forest quiet of an entirely different kind. Mist settled low over a river gorge in what is now West Virginia, water moving through a valley whose very name would eventually derive from the people who once lived along its banks, and then, with startling completeness, seemed to vanish from it entirely. The Moneton of the Kanawha Valley. The Moneton presents one of the more genuinely puzzling case studies in this entire exploration, precisely because so little about them can be stated with real confidence. What is documented comes almost entirely from a single, brief window of European contact. The 1671 expedition of Thomas Batts and Robert Fallam, English explorers commissioned by Virginia colonial authorities to search for a westward route toward the Pacific, who crossed the Appalachian Divide and descended into the Kanawha Valley, where they encountered a people their journal records as the Moneton, a name whose meaning and even whose precise pronunciation in the Moneton's own language remains uncertain, filtered as it is through 17th century English phonetic guesswork. Batts and Fallam's account, brief as it is, describes a substantial town along the Kanawha River, its Moneton inhabitants engaged in agriculture and apparently possessing some knowledge of or trade connections toward both the Great Lakes region to the north and Spanish territory, somewhere to the distant south or west. Intriguing but frustratingly vague details that later historians have never been able to fully verify or contextualize. The expedition's journal represents, as far as surviving documentation shows, essentially the only detailed European eyewitness account of the Moneton that exists. No sustained colonial contact followed, no missionary account, no extended trade relationship, no later colonial census ever returns to describe them again in any comparable detail. And then, within a matter of decades, the Moneton simply disappear from the documentary record entirely. By the early 18th century, when English and later American settlement began moving into the Kanawha Valley in earnest, no Moneton communities remained to be documented, traded with, or displaced through treaty. The valley appears, to those later arrivals, essentially uninhabited by any settled indigenous population, used at most as shared hunting territory by various Iroquoian and Shawnee groups whose primary territories lay elsewhere. What happened to the people Batts and Fallam described in 1671 during the roughly 50 years between that expedition and sustained American settlement is, quite simply, not documented anywhere that historians have yet located. This absence has generated more historical speculation, proportionally, than almost any other people examined in this series, precisely because the documentary silence is so complete and so quick. The most widely accepted explanation among historians follows the pattern already established by the Erie's destruction in the same general era. The Moneton, like so many smaller Iroquoian and regionally distinct peoples of the mid to late 17th century, may have been caught in the same wave of Haudenosaunee military expansion and the broader realignment of eastern woodland power driven by the fur trade and European firearms, a period sometimes referred to by historians as the Beaver Wars, during which numerous smaller nations across a vast stretch of eastern North America were destroyed, dispersed, or absorbed within the span of a few violent decades. Under this reading, the Moneton simply represent one more casualty of that broader continental upheaval, their destruction or dispersal simply never separately documented because no European chronicler happened to be present to record it, unlike the Jesuit missionaries who at least left a paper trail for the Erie's demise. Other historians and researchers have proposed less certain, more speculative possibilities. Some have suggested the Moneton may have relocated westward or southward as a body, merging into a larger, better documented nation whose own oral traditions or colonial records might contain an unrecognized trace of Moneton absorption, though no specific candidate nation has been conclusively identified through either linguistic or genealogical evidence. Still others have noted the intriguing, if thin, possibility that the Moneton's apparent trade connections toward Spanish territory, as vaguely referenced in the Batts and Fallam journal, might indicate broader regional relationships extending further than conventional maps of the 17th century Southeast typically suggest. a hypothesis interesting enough to mention, but resting on evidence too fragmentary to support any firm conclusion. Archaeology offers only partial help. The Kanawha Valley holds documented earthwork and mound sites, including significant complexes near present-day Charleston, West Virginia, some clearly predating the historic period bats and phalum witnessed by many centuries. Whether any of these specific sites represent Moneton construction or the work of earlier, culturally distinct populations who occupied the same valley in a much deeper past, remains genuinely unresolved. The same continuity question that has shadowed the Fort Center earthworks, the AI's shell middens, and so many other sites across this exploration, here rendered even murkier by the near-total absence of any detailed historic-era account to anchor the archaeological evidence against. What makes the Moneton case distinct, even among the many uncertain histories gathered in this series, is the sheer brevity of the documentary window itself. A single expedition, a handful of journal pages, and then nothing. No missionary spent years among them as with the Apalachee. No shipwrecked castaway lived among them for decades as Fontaneda did among the Ais and Mayaimi. No 20th century linguist arrived to salvage their language before the last speaker died, because by the time anyone might have thought to look, there was apparently no one left to find. The Kanawha River still runs through that same valley, past industrial towns and highway bridges that have reshaped the landscape almost beyond recognition since 1671. Somewhere beneath that development, or perhaps simply lost to 5 decades of unrecorded history between one brief expedition and the next wave of settlement, lies whatever remains of the people who lived along its banks long enough to leave their name on the water itself. A name preserved, and a people otherwise almost entirely unaccounted for. What became of the town bats and phalum described in the 50 years no one thought to write down? South from the Kanawha's industrial banks, down through the Appalachians and across 1,000 miles of changing terrain, the land eventually flattens again into Florida's interior, into the spring-fed rivers and oak hammocks of what is now Marion and Lake counties, where a small, fiercely independent chiefdom once controlled a river valley that would later lend its name to a modern Florida county, though almost nothing else about the people who lived there survives in common memory. The Acuera. The Acuera occupied territory centered along the Ocklawaha River watershed in central Florida, a landscape defined by natural springs, oak and pine hammocks, and river systems connecting inland Florida toward the St. Johns River and, eventually, the Atlantic. They appear in the documentary record earlier than many peoples examined in this series, surfacing in accounts connected to Hernando de Soto's expedition through Florida in 1539, when Spanish chroniclers recorded contact with a chiefdom called Acuera as de Soto's forces moved through the interior. Contact that, notably, did not go smoothly. Surviving Spanish accounts describe the Acuera as openly hostile toward de Soto's forces, refusing cooperation and, according to some records, delivering a defiant message to the Spanish commander that later chroniclers preserved as an unusually direct statement of resistance, rare among the more measured or ambiguous diplomatic exchanges recorded elsewhere on that expedition. That early hostility appears, on the surface, to have served the Acuera reasonably well, at least in the short term. Unlike coastal peoples exposed to sustained Spanish shipping routes and repeated contact, the Acuera's inland position offered a degree of continued insulation from the earliest and most intensive waves of Spanish disease and colonial pressure. When Franciscan missionaries eventually established a mission presence in Acuera territory in the 17th century, decades after de Soto's brief and violent passage, the relationship that developed appears to have been considerably more complex and, at times, more strained than the deeper institutional partnership that took root among the neighboring Apalachee to the northwest. Spanish records from this later mission period describe recurring friction, occasional open resistance, and a chiefdom that seems to have accepted mission presence more as pragmatic accommodation to shifting regional power than as any wholesale embrace of Spanish religious or political authority. By the latter half of the 17th century, the same pressures reshaping indigenous Florida everywhere else in this exploration reached the Acuera as well. Epidemic disease moving steadily through mission-connected populations, And by the early 18th century, the same catastrophic wave of English-allied Creek and Yamasee raiding that had already devastated Apalachee province and pushed the AIs toward eventual evacuation to Cuba. Surviving Spanish and later British colonial records describe Acuera communities scattered, reduced, and increasingly difficult to distinguish from other remnant Timucuan-speaking groups in the region. Because the Acuera, unlike many of the smaller linguistic isolates examined elsewhere in this series, spoke a dialect of Timucua, the same broad language family shared by numerous other central and northern Florida chiefdoms, a linguistic connection that would ultimately complicate any effort to trace their distinct fate separately from their neighbors. This is, in its way, the central puzzle of the Acuera story. Their absorption into the broader collapse of Timucuan Florida across the 18th century was so thorough, and their language so closely shared with related peoples, that historians have struggled to identify where Acuera identity specifically ends and where it simply dissolves into the general catastrophic decline of Florida's Timucua-speaking peoples as a whole. A decline so severe that by the time Spain ceded Florida to Britain in 1763, the number of documented Timucuan speakers remaining across the entire peninsula had fallen to a small fraction of pre-contact populations, with most survivors evacuated to Cuba alongside remnant AIs and other South Florida groups in that same mass departure already described. Did any Acuera specifically number among those Cuban evacuees, carrying a distinct memory of their River Valley chiefdom into permanent exile? Spanish evacuation records rarely specified tribal identity with the precision modern historians would need to answer that question with any confidence. The Ocklawaha River Valley itself holds archaeological evidence of long continuous habitation, including mound and midden sites that predate the historic Acuera chiefdom by many centuries, following the same pattern of deep, uncertain continuity that has recurred throughout this exploration, sites whose full excavation and analysis has, in this comparatively less studied corner of central Florida, lagged behind better-funded archaeological work conducted elsewhere in the state. The Ocklawaha's famous springs, including Silver Springs, one of the largest and most productive freshwater springs in the world, would have anchored Acuera life in ways archaeologists are still working to fully reconstruct, their crystalline waters having drawn human habitation for thousands of years before any Spanish chronicler recorded the defiant message a local chief once sent to De Soto. What remains, mostly, is that single striking moment of resistance in 1539, a chiefdom bold enough to refuse Spain's most feared conquistador outright, standing out sharply against the more ambiguous accommodations so many other Florida peoples eventually made. And then, gradually, the quieter dissolution that followed. No dramatic massacre, no single closing chapter, simply a slow merging into the broader tragic story of Timucuan Florida's collapse. Beneath the oak hammocks and spring-fed waters of the Ocklawaha Valley, what remains of the specific people bold enough to defy De Soto himself, and how much of their story quietly disappeared into a larger, shared Timucuan fate, the documentary record was never precise enough to separate back out. It is worth noting at this point in the journey how often the deepest uncertainty in this exploration hasn't come from famous massacres or dramatic captivity narratives, but from the quieter cases. Chiefdoms swallowed into a larger linguistic family, as with the Acuera, or peoples whose very name survives only because a handful of colonial officials happened to write it down before the trail went cold. That second kind of story plays out once more along the humid, marshy coastline of southeastern Texas, near Galveston Bay, home to a small and little-remembered coastal people, the Akokisa. The Akokisa occupied territory along the upper Texas Gulf Coast, centered roughly around Galveston Bay and the lower reaches of the Trinity and San Jacinto rivers, a landscape of coastal marsh, pine forest, and brackish estuary, not unlike the terrain that once sustained the Atakapa further east along the Louisiana coast. In fact, most linguists and historians classify the Akokisa as an Atakapan-speaking people, closely related linguistically to the Atakapa proper, sharing similar coastal subsistence patterns built around fishing, oyster and shellfish gathering, and seasonal hunting across the bay's rich estuarine environment. A cultural and linguistic connection that places the Akokisa within the same broader, still debated Gulf language hypothesis, already discussed in connection with their eastern neighbors. French and Spanish colonial contact with the Akokisa began in earnest during the late 17th century, following the ill-fated French expedition of René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, whose failed Texas colony at Fort St. Louis brought sustained European attention to the upper Texas coast for the first time. Spanish expeditions sent to locate and expel the French intruders subsequently documented contact with several coastal Texas peoples, including the Akokisa, whom Spanish sources describe as living in small dispersed communities along the bay, without the larger, more politically consolidated chiefdom structure documented among peoples like the Tocobaga or Apalachee farther east. This dispersed settlement pattern, common among many Gulf coastal peoples whose environment rewarded small mobile communities over large fixed towns, would later complicate Spanish efforts to establish any lasting mission presence among them. That mission effort, when it eventually came, proved characteristically brief. Spanish missionaries established a short-lived mission specifically intended to serve the Akokisa and neighboring Bidai people in the 1750s. Part of a broader, generally unsuccessful Spanish effort to secure the upper Texas coast against French, and later, growing Anglo-American interest in the region. Colonial records describe the mission struggling from the outset with low and inconsistent attendance, reflecting a pattern seen among several small, dispersed coastal peoples throughout this exploration who resisted the settled, concentrated lifestyle mission life demanded, preferring instead the seasonal mobility their traditional subsistence patterns had always required. Within a matter of years, Spanish authorities abandoned the effort as unsustainable, leaving the Akokisa largely outside any lasting colonial institutional framework for the remainder of the 18th century. What followed is, in outline, a familiar story by this point in the series. Continued exposure to European disease through sporadic contact, gradual displacement as Spanish, then Mexican, then Anglo-American settlement pushed steadily into the upper Texas coast, and a documentary record that grows progressively thinner through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. By the time Texas achieved independence in 1836 and American settlement accelerated dramatically across the region, colonial and territorial records no longer describe any distinct Akokisa community at all. The people simply absent from a documentary landscape that, a century earlier, had specifically named and mapped them. This raises a question that has recurred in various forms throughout nearly every chapter of this exploration. Did the Akokisa die out through disease and displacement in any documentable sense, or did they instead merge quietly into neighboring communities, Atakapa proper to the east, Bidai and Karankawa along the coast, or later Mexican and Anglo-Texan settlements, their distinct identity simply dissolving into these larger, better documented groups without any single recorded moment marking that transition? Some historians have proposed that Akokisa identity may have persisted informally within Atakapa or mixed coastal communities well into the 19th century, given the close linguistic and cultural relationship between the two peoples, though establishing that continuity with any documentary confidence remains genuinely difficult, given how sparse Akokisa-specific records become after the 1750s mission's collapse. Archaeological evidence for the upper Texas coast, including scattered shell midden sites around Galveston Bay, continues to add material detail to the region's deeper pre-contact history, though systematic excavation specifically targeting confirmed Akokisa sites has remained limited, constrained by the same rapid coastal development and erosion that has claimed archaeological evidence throughout the Gulf Coast, from the Atakapa's Louisiana marshes to the Karankawa's barrier islands further south. What those unexcavated middens might reveal about a small coastal people who briefly appeared in Spanish and French colonial records, resisted mission life, and then simply faded from the documentary landscape entirely remains, for now, an open question. Galveston Bay today is one of the most heavily developed and industrialized estuaries on the entire Gulf Coast, its shoreline reshaped by ship channels, refineries, and sprawling suburban growth radiating outward from Houston. Beneath that transformation, scattered and largely unexamined, may lie whatever remains of the Akokisa's brief, thinly documented presence. a people named by outsiders passing through, encountered just long enough to be recorded, and then left to disappear from the page in exactly the kind of silence this entire exploration has learned. Again and again. Never quite means the same thing as absence. What, precisely, happened to the Akokisa in those quiet decades between a failed 1750s mission and Texas statehood? And is there anyone left in any Gulf Coast family's oral tradition who still carries a fragment of that answer without quite knowing it? That failed 1750s mission, established to serve the Akokisa, was never intended for them alone. Spanish records name a second people alongside them from the very beginning, a neighboring nation whose territory lay somewhat further inland, along the Trinity River and the piney woods of what is now eastern Texas. A people who would go on to occupy a position of surprising importance in the regional trade networks of colonial Texas, before fading, in their turn, from the documentary record, the Bidai. The Bidai homeland stretched across the forested interior of eastern Texas, roughly between the Trinity and Neches rivers, territory transitional between the coastal marshlands the Akokisa and Atakapa knew, and the deeper piney woods extending toward Louisiana and the broader Caddo cultural sphere further north and east. Linguistically, the Bidai's precise affiliations remained somewhat less settled than those of their Atakapan-speaking coastal neighbors. Some researchers have proposed a connection to the same Atakapan language family, while others treat Bidai as a distinct, more uncertain linguistic entity, its classification complicated, as with so many small Texas and Gulf Coast peoples examined in this series, by the thinness of the surviving vocabulary record available for comparison. What distinguished the Bidai from many of their neighbors was their position within colonial Texas's regional trade economy. Spanish records from the 18th century repeatedly describe the Bidai as active and skilled traders, serving as intermediaries between Spanish colonial settlements, French Louisiana traders operating illegally across the Texas border, and other indigenous nations throughout the region, including the more powerful Caddo confederacies to the north and east. This trading role gave the Bidai an economic significance disproportionate to their population, and Spanish colonial officials, despite general policy discouraging French trade within Texas territory, frequently found themselves unable to fully suppress Bidai trading relationships with French Louisiana, relationships that persisted well into the 18th century, despite repeated colonial efforts to redirect that commerce through official Spanish channels instead. This intermediary position offers a genuinely intriguing possibility that historians have noted without being able to fully resolve. Did the Bidai's central role in regional trade networks grant them access to information, goods, and diplomatic relationships across a wider swath of the interior Southeast than their comparatively small geographically confined homeland might otherwise suggest? Spanish accounts occasionally reference Bidai knowledge of and contact with peoples considerably further afield than their immediate neighbors, details that hint at a far more extensive web of interior trade and communication than the fragmentary colonial record can fully reconstruct, though the specifics of those wider connections remain frustratingly vague in the sources that survive. The 1750s mission effort that briefly attempted to serve both the Bidai and Akokisa together met the same fate already described in the previous chapter: low attendance, resistance to settled mission life, and eventual Spanish abandonment of the project within a few years. Unlike their coastal Akokisa neighbors, however, the Bidai's more inland forested territory offered somewhat greater insulation from the earliest and most intensive waves of European settlement pressure, allowing Bidai communities to persist as a documented, distinct people somewhat longer than several of the smaller coastal groups already examined in this exploration. That persistence, though, had firm limits: continued epidemic disease, steady encroachment from expanding Anglo-American settlement following Texas's opening to American immigration in the 1820s, and increasing pressure on the region's game and forest resources combined across the early 19th century to reduce the Bidai population substantially. By the time of Texas independence in 1836 and the following decades of accelerating American settlement, colonial and early American territorial records describe the Bidai as reduced to small remnant communities, some apparently merging with Caddo groups to the north, others integrating into growing Mexican and Anglo-Texan settlements in the region. the same pattern of quiet absorption already documented for the Akokisa and so many other small Gulf region peoples throughout this series. The precise final chapter of independent Bidai identity, though, resists easy dating. 19th century American ethnographers and territorial officials, arriving relatively late to systematically document Texas's smaller indigenous nations, found little remaining evidence of any distinct, self-identifying Bidai community by the mid-19th century, though scattered references to individuals or families of documented Bidai descent persist in some regional records into the following decades, suggesting a gradual dissolution into surrounding communities rather than any single, clearly dated endpoint. This pattern, common enough across the Gulf Coast peoples already examined in this exploration, nonetheless makes the Bidai case notably difficult to pin down with any real precision, their disappearance from the record less a single closing door than a slow fading, whose exact final moment simply was not important enough, from a colonial or early American administrative perspective, for anyone to bother recording. Archaeological work in the Piney Woods region of eastern Texas, the Bidai's traditional homeland, has identified numerous habitation sites reflecting long-term indigenous occupation, though as with so many interior Texas and Gulf Coast peoples in this series, systematic excavation and analysis specifically targeting confirmed Bidai sites remains comparatively limited relative to the region's overall archaeological potential. What those forested sites might still reveal about a people whose skill and trade briefly made them indispensable to colonial Texas, and whose final disappearance from any distinct historical account came so gradually that no single date can properly mark it, remains an open question for future research to address. Somewhere in that eastern Texas timberland, beneath pine needles and generations of logging and agricultural development, lies whatever physical trace remains of the Bidai's forgotten trade routes and forest communities, intermediaries once essential enough to frustrate an entire colonial government's trade policy, and yet quiet enough, in their final decades, to leave behind no clear record of when, precisely, their story as a distinct people finally came to its end. From the eastern Texas timberland, the story returns once more to Florida's Gulf Coast, this time to the shallow, mangrove-fringed waters at the mouth of Tampa Bay, somewhat south of the Tocobaga's territory already examined earlier in this exploration, where a small and elusive chiefdom appears only fleetingly across nearly 2 centuries of Spanish colonial documentation, never fully resolved into the kind of detailed portrait available for its larger neighbors, the Pohoy. The Pohoy occupied territory along the southern and eastern shores of Tampa Bay, in close enough proximity to the Tocobaga's safety harbor territory to the north that Spanish sources sometimes struggled to clearly distinguish the two chiefdoms' respective boundaries and political relationships. Like the Tocobaga, the Pohoy appear to have built their subsistence economy primarily around the bay's rich marine resources, fishing and shellfish gathering, supplemented by limited use of the surrounding pine flatwoods and coastal hammock, a pattern consistent with the broader safety harbor cultural tradition that archaeologists associate with several related Tampa Bay chiefdoms during this period. What makes the Pohoy a genuinely difficult people to document, even relative to the already fragmentary record available for the Tocobaga, is the persistent ambiguity in Spanish sources regarding their political status and relationship to their more prominent northern neighbors. Some Spanish accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe the Pohoy as a subordinate or tributary group under Tocobaga authority. Others treat them as a distinct, independently governed chiefdom in their own right, occasionally in tension or open conflict with the Tocobaga rather than allied beneath them. Modern historians and archaeologists remain genuinely divided on which interpretation better reflects the actual political reality of the Tampa Bay region during this period, a disagreement rooted less in contradictory evidence than in the sheer thinness of the evidence itself, filtered as it is through Spanish observers who visited the bay only sporadically and who had limited interest in precisely mapping the internal political relationships among the various coastal groups they encountered. The Pohoy surface intermittently across the Spanish colonial record for nearly 2 centuries, appearing in scattered references connected to failed mission efforts, occasional violent encounters with Spanish shipping and salvage operations along the bay, and brief administrative mentions tied to broader Spanish attempts to manage and monitor Florida's Gulf Coast chiefdoms. One of the more notable episodes involves reported Pohoy involvement in attacks on Spanish vessels and salvage operations during the 17th century, incidents that colonial records treat with the same wary transactional tone already familiar from the Ace's wrecking economy on Florida's opposite coast, though considerably less thoroughly documented in the Pohoy's case, without any comparable first-hand account like Fontanetta's captivity narrative to provide sustained interior detail. By the early 18th century, the same catastrophic pressures already chronicled throughout this Florida-focused portion of the exploration: epidemic disease, English-allied Creek and Yamasee raiding, and the broader collapse of Spanish Florida's colonial infrastructure, bore down on the Pohoy alongside their Tocobaga neighbors, the Timucua to the north, and the Ayas and Tequesta further south and east. Surviving Spanish records describe Pohoy remnants relocating southward in the early 18th century, seeking shelter among the more powerful and better documented Calusa Confederacy of southwest Florida, a pattern of absorption into a larger, more thoroughly recorded neighbor that recalls the Mayaimi's own likely fate around Lake Okeechobee, and that appears, in outline if not in precise detail, to have been genuinely common among Florida's smaller Gulf Coast chiefdoms during this final chaotic period of Spanish colonial collapse. This absorption into Calusa territory raises a familiar, and, by this point in the exploration, recurring problem. Once merged into a larger political and cultural entity, how much of any group's distinct identity survives in a form later observers, whether Spanish colonial officials or modern historians, can actually recognize and separately trace. Spanish and later British colonial records from the mid-18th century onward rarely distinguish Pohoy identity from the broader South Florida refugee populations increasingly grouped together under labels like Calusa, or simply Indians of the southern coast, meaning that whatever became of specifically Pohoy communities after their relocation southward is, in any documentary sense, essentially unrecoverable. When the final Spanish evacuation of Florida's remaining indigenous population to Cuba took place in 1763, following the same broader pattern already described for the AIs, Tequesta, and remnant Timucua, colonial evacuation records offer no clear indication of whether any specifically identified Pohoy individuals or families numbered among those departing. The Pohoy name itself simply stops appearing in the documentary record sometime in the decades before that final evacuation, its precise final mention lost somewhere in the general administrative chaos of Spanish Florida's last troubled century. Archaeological evidence for the specific Pohoy homeland along southern and eastern Tampa Bay remains, like so much of this region's material record, constrained by more than a century of aggressive coastal development, with numerous shell-midden and habitation sites likely destroyed before any systematic documentation could take place, following the same pattern of loss already described for the Tocobaga's own territory just to the north. Whether any Pohoy-specific archaeological signature can even be reliably distinguished from the broader safety harbor cultural material associated with the Tocobaga remains a genuinely open methodological question, one that underscores just how thin the boundary between these two closely related, geographically adjacent Tampa Bay peoples has always been in the surviving record. What remains, in the end, is a name that surfaces and submerges repeatedly across 2 centuries of fragmentary Spanish documentation, never quite resolving into a clear independent portrait, and never quite dissolving entirely into its more thoroughly recorded neighbors either. Somewhere along Tampa Bay's southern and eastern shoreline, beneath the same relentless development that has already claimed so much of the Tocobaga's physical record, does any specific trace of Pohoy identity remain distinguishable at all? Or has that particular thread, thin as it always was in the documentary record, already been pulled entirely into the broader, tangled history of the peoples who absorbed them,